8 royal families control most of Europe. 3 banking dynasties control most of the world's wealth. And if you trace their genealogies back, really back, through the medieval records, through Rome, through claimed Trojan ancestors, they all converge on the same place, ancient Mesopotamia. 12 dynasties, 1 clay prism, and a claim so extraordinary that modern scholars dismiss it as mythology: kingship descended from heaven. But what if they weren't speaking metaphorically? What if the bloodlines they documented obsessively, mathematically, across 1,000 years are the same bloodlines sitting in Davos right now? There's a clay prism sitting in a glass case at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England. Catalogue number AN 1923, book 444. Most scholars call it the Weld-Blundell prism. It's roughly 8 inches tall, 4-sided, made of baked clay the colour of dried blood. Herbert Weld-Blundell excavated it in 1922 near the ancient city of Larsa in southern Iraq. It's been sitting behind glass for a century, while maybe a few hundred people per year actually stop to read what it says. If you stood in front of it today, you'd see 400 lines of cuneiform script, wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay before it was baked hard. 4 sides, dense columns of text, every character still sharp after 4,000 years. The clay was soft once. Someone's hands shaped it. Someone's reed stylus pressed these marks. Someone who lived closer in time to us than to the events they were documenting decided this information was important enough to preserve in the most permanent medium they had. This isn't mythology. This isn't poetry. This isn't a religious hymn. It's a list of kings, a list of cities, a list of how long each king ruled, a list of dynasties, who came from where, who succeeded whom, which families held power, and for how long. The Sumerians were accountants. They invented writing specifically to keep track of things: barley rations, sheep herds, labour obligations, land ownership. They were obsessive about documentation, and they applied that same obsessive precision to documenting their rulers. The prism opens with a single line in Sumerian, Namlugal Antadidar. Kingship descended from heaven. Not kingship was blessed by heaven. Not kingship was approved by heaven. Not the king was chosen by the gods. Kingship, the institution, the authority, the right to rule, descended, came down, moved from point A in the sky to point B on earth. The verb is the same one used in warehouse receipts. Barley descended from the storehouse to the workers. Physical movement, material transfer. And then the list begins. When kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. 8 kings ruled before a catastrophic flood. After the flood swept over, kingship descended from heaven again. That word again matters. We'll come back to it. And 12 major royal dynasties emerged. 12 families who claimed they didn't just rule because they were strong or smart or popular. They ruled because they carried something in their blood, something that came from the beings who brought kingship down from heaven in the first place. Now here's where it gets interesting. Those 12 dynasties didn't disappear into history. They documented their genealogies with the same precision they used for everything else. Temple archives full of family records, marriage contracts, succession documents. And when subsequent empires conquered Mesopotamia, the Hittites, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, they didn't erase those bloodlines. They married into them. They adopted the genealogical claims. They transported the legitimacy framework westward. Medieval European nobility traced their ancestry back to Troy. Troy was a Hittite vassal state. The Hittites documented marriage alliances with Mesopotamian royal families. We have the tablets. We'll look at them. Roman patrician families claimed Trojan descent. Germanic nobility claimed Roman descent. Every major European royal house today traces back through these claimed connections to the ancient Near East. And here's the part that should make you pause. Modern genetic studies support ancient admixture from the Near East into European elite populations during the Bronze Age. The genealogical claims that scholars dismissed as medieval fabrications turn out to have genetic evidence supporting them. So we're going to do something historians usually avoid. We're going to take these ancient records seriously, not as mythology, not as propaganda, but as what they claim to be, genealogical documentation. We're going to trace the 12 bloodlines forward through every conquest, every migration, every name change, all the way to the families holding power today. Before we start that journey, comment below. Which modern family's ancestry are you most curious about? The British royals, the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers? Because by the end of this investigation, also write where you are listening from. We're connecting all of them back to specific dynasties on this clay prism. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is following documented genealogies and asking what they mean. The tablets exist. The family records exist. The genetic evidence exists. The concentration of power in specific families exists. What we're investigating is whether these things are connected, and if so, how and why. Let's start with what the clay prism actually documents. Let's start before the flood. Before the waters rose. The World Blundell prism lists 8 kings who ruled before the catastrophe. Not vague antiquity, specific kings, specific cities, specific reign lengths. And this is where modern scholars stop taking it seriously, because the numbers are impossible. Alulim ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Enmen-Luana ruled Bad Tabira for 43,200 years. Enmen-Garlana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumazid, yes, the same figure who appears in later myths as Inanna's shepherd lover, ruled for 36,000 years. Sipad-Zid-Ana ruled Larak for 28,800 years. Enmen-Durana ruled Sippa for 21,000 years. And Ubaratutu ruled Shurupak for 18,600 years. Add them up, 241,200 years of documented kingship before the flood. Mainstream scholarship's response, obviously mythological inflation. Ancient peoples exaggerated the antiquity of their origins to establish legitimacy. The numbers are symbolic, not historical. Don't take them literally. But here's the problem with that dismissal. The Sumerians were not prone to symbolic exaggeration when it came to numbers. We have thousands of their administrative tablets. They calculated compound interest. They tracked astronomical cycles with precision that wouldn't be matched in Europe until the Renaissance. The Plimpton 322 tablet, sitting in Columbia University's collection, demonstrates they understood Pythagorean triples 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. These were people who took mathematics seriously. The same scribal schools that produced accurate astronomical tables and architectural calculations also produced the king list. Why would they suddenly abandon precision for the most important document they created, the record of legitimate authority? And the numbers aren't random. They're multiples of 3,600, the Sumerian Shah, a key unit in their sexagesimal Sikh counting system. Alulim, 28,800 in Shakate Shah. Alalgar, 36,000 Talas, 10 Shah. Enmen-Luana, 43,200 Talas, 12 Shah. The reign lengths are mathematically structured. Multiple independent copies of the king list preserve the same numbers. the Weld Blundell Prism, tablet WB62, also at the Ashmolean, fragments from Nippur in the University of Pennsylvania Museum, fragments from in the British Museum, across different cities, different time periods, different scribal traditions, the same kings, the same sequence, the same impossible numbers. That's not how mythology evolves. Myths change with each telling. These numbers were standardized, fixed, preserved with the precision of legal documents. So we're left with a question: what were they documenting? 3 possibilities, and we're going to keep all 3 open as we proceed. Possibility 1, these are symbolic numbers encoding something other than literal years, perhaps generations, perhaps dynasties, perhaps cycles of some kind. The specific encoding is lost to us, but the underlying structure is real genealogical information compressed into numerical form. Possibility 2, these numbers reflect a different way of counting time, or represent the reigns of institutions rather than individuals. Alulim might be a title held by successive rulers, with 28,800 years representing the total duration of that office across multiple holders. Possibility 3, the numbers are accurate, and our understanding of human history before 3000 BC is fundamentally incomplete. For now, we don't need to resolve which interpretation is correct. What matters is what happens next. Then the flood swept over. 1 line, 5 words in English, 3 in Sumerian, Rubara. The flood came. And this is where the king list transforms from impossible curiosity to something that demands attention. Because the flood isn't just mythology, it's geology. Archaeologists excavating Sumerian cities in the 1920s and 30s, Shuruppak, Kish, found something they didn't expect: distinct flood layers. Sterile silt deposits 8 to 11 feet thick, sitting between occupation layers. Below the silt, pottery and tools from one cultural period. Above it, pottery and tools from a later period. The silt itself contained no artifacts, no remains, just river sediment that had settled out of standing water. Sir Leonard Woolley, excavating the Royal Cemetery of Ur in 1929, initially thought he'd reached virgin soil beneath the city. Then he kept digging and found another occupation layer beneath the flood deposit. His workmen, locals from the area, told him immediately, that is the flood of Noah. Carbon dating places these flood deposits around 2900 BCE. Not a global deluge, there's no geological evidence for that, but a catastrophic regional flood in southern Mesopotamia that would have appeared world-ending to anyone living there. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers, fed by snowmelt from the Zagros and Taurus mountains, occasionally produce devastating floods, even today. 4,000 years ago, with more primitive flood control infrastructure, a major flooding event could have buried the entire alluvial plain underwater for weeks or months. Multiple Mesopotamian texts describe the same event. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBSN 673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the gods deciding to destroy humanity through flood, with the god Enki warning Ziusudra to build a boat. The Atrahasis epic, preserved on multiple tablets in the British Museum, describes the same event with additional detail: the noise of humanity disturbing the gods, the decision to eliminate the problem, one family's survival. And then, in the king list, after the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. 3 things to notice. First, again, kingship descended from heaven a second time. The same process that established the antediluvian kings is repeated after the catastrophe. Whatever brought kingship the first time brings it a second time. Second, the location changes. Before the flood, kingship was in Eridu, the southernmost major city. After the flood, it's in Kish, further north, as if the centre of civilization shifted with the survivors. Third, the reign lengths change. Post-flood kings still have impossibly long reigns by modern standards. The first king of Kish ruled 1200 years, according to the list, but the numbers are dropping. 1200 years instead of 28,800, then 900 years, then 600, progressively approaching human parameters over the following dynasties. If these were pure inventions, why show decline? Why not maintain the impressive ancient numbers to make later kings seem equally legitimate? The pattern of decreasing reign lengths suggests the list is documenting something real, a transition from one kind of ruler to another, or one way of counting to another, or one reality to another. And here's what matters for our investigation. The post-flood dynasties claim genealogical connection to what came before. They don't say the old world ended and we started fresh. They say kingship descended from heaven again, implying connection to the previous descent. They claim that certain families survived the catastrophe, that those families carried forward the bloodlines established before the flood, that the divine human mixing that created the antediluvian kings didn't end, it continued through selected survivors. Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, doesn't just survive the flood in the Eridu Genesis. He receives immortality and divine status afterward. He becomes something between human and God. And he becomes, in the mythology, the ancestor of subsequent humanity. This pattern, catastrophe, selective survival, elevated status for survivors, genealogical claims connecting post-catastrophe rulers to pre-catastrophe divinity, is the foundation of everything that follows. Because now we get to the 12 major dynasties that emerged after the flood, each claiming this special ancestry, each maintaining it obsessively through 1,000 years of documented history. Before we enumerate them, understand what we're looking at. These aren't all the cities or all the rulers mentioned in Mesopotamian records. These are 12 specific dynasties that the king list and related texts emphasize, 12 families who claimed the strongest connection to the original divine bloodlines, 12 houses whose genealogical records were preserved with particular care, 12 lineages that subsequent conquerors felt compelled to connect themselves to, even if they had to fabricate the connection. The number 12 itself appears repeatedly in Mesopotamian religious and political structure. 12 major gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon, 12 months in the Mesopotamian calendar, 12 divisions of the zodiac first documented in Mesopotamian astronomy. Whether the 12 dynasties were chosen to match this cosmological structure, or whether the cosmological structure reflects the political reality, we can't know. But the pattern is there, so let's name them. Let's identify the 12 bloodlines that this investigation will trace forward through time to the boardrooms and palaces of today, from 8 kings to 12 dynasties. After the flood, kingship doesn't follow one continuous line anymore. It branches. Multiple cities claim legitimate authority simultaneously, sometimes fighting each other, sometimes acknowledging each other's status. The Sumerian king list documents this by saying kingship was taken to different cities, Kish, then Uruk, then then back to Kish, in a complex pattern of succession that historians still debate. But within that complexity, 12 dynasties stand out. 12 families whose claims to divine ancestry were documented most thoroughly, whose succession was most carefully recorded, whose legitimacy was most widely acknowledged even by their rivals. Let me be clear about what we're doing here. We're identifying these 12 based on multiple criteria: prominence in the king list itself, supporting documentation in other texts, archaeological confirmation of their power, the extent of preserved genealogical records, and their importance to subsequent dynasties who claimed connection to them. This isn't arbitrary. These are the dynasties that mattered to the ancient Mesopotamians themselves, the ones they kept coming back to, the ones they treated as the foundation of legitimate authority. Dynasty number 1, the first dynasty of Kish. After the flood had swept over, when kingship descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. Kish is the first post-flood capital, 23 kings documented in the king list. The dynasty begins with Gar-Ur, about whom we know almost nothing except that he ruled 1,1200 years according to the list. Then comes Gola-Nidaba-Anapad, Palakinatim, and a succession of names that are difficult to reconstruct because the tablets are damaged. But then we get to Etana. Etana, who ascended to heaven, is the most famous king of the first Kish dynasty. He appears not just in the king list, but in separate Sumerian and Akkadian myths. The myth says Etana was unable to have children. The royal bloodline was threatened with extinction. He prays to the sun god Shamash, who directs him to rescue an eagle trapped in a pit. The eagle, grateful, carries Etana up to heaven to obtain the plant of birth that will allow his wife to conceive. Read that as mythology if you want. But notice what it's actually about: the obsessive concern with continuing the bloodline. Etana doesn't go to heaven for wisdom or power or wealth. He goes to ensure he has an heir. The maintenance of the royal bloodline is so important that it justifies a journey to the divine realm. Etana succeeds. His son Bailey is born and becomes king after him. The bloodline continues. The first dynasty of Kish was excavated by Stephen Langdon and others in the 1920s and 30s. They found massive mud brick architecture, royal tombs, evidence of centralized power. This wasn't mythology. These were real rulers controlling real territory. The dynasty's total documented reign in the king list, 24,510 years across 23 kings. The numbers are still inflated, but dropping. The first king's 1,200 years has become more typical reign lengths of 400 years, then 300, then eventually approaching realistic numbers. And every subsequent dynasty that claims legitimacy looks back to Kish. Even when kingship is taken to Uruk, the Uruk kings acknowledge Kish as the source of post-flood authority. Dynasty number 2, the first dynasty of Uruk. Uruk is the city of Gilgamesh. In the king list, the first dynasty of Uruk includes 12 kings, beginning with Mesopotamia, who entered the sea and ascended the mountain. His son is Enmerkar, the legendary founder of Uruk who built its walls. Then comes Lugalbanda, the shepherd who became king. And then Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the most famous works of ancient literature. But before it was literature, Gilgamesh was a historical king. The king list places him firmly in the sequence: son of Lugalbanda, ruler of Uruk, reigning 126 years. What matters for our investigation is Gilgamesh's genealogy, because the epic preserves it explicitly. His father is Lugalbanda, a human king, though the myths say Lugalbanda was semi-divine himself. His mother is the goddess Ninsun, not a priestess representing the goddess, not a woman blessed by the goddess herself. The epic states it clearly: 2/3 of him is God, 1/3 of him is human. Think about that fraction. 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. That only makes sense if divinity is something that can be measured, quantified, inherited. It's genetic language. If Gilgamesh's mother is fully divine and his father is half divine, as the myths suggest about Lugalbanda, then Gilgamesh is 3/4 divine, which rounds to 2/3 in Sumerian mathematical approximation. This isn't symbolic, this is a bloodline claim. Gilgamesh rules Uruk because of what he inherited from his parents. The Epic of Gilgamesh is ultimately about mortality. Gilgamesh, 2/3 divine, watches his friend Enkidu die and becomes obsessed with escaping death himself. He journeys to find Utnapishtim, the Akkadian name for the flood survivor, the Sumerian Ziusudra, who has been granted immortality. Gilgamesh wants to know how to achieve the same thing. Why? Because he's 2/3 divine, but 1/3 human, and that 1/3 is killing him. He's watching his divine nature war with his human mortality. Utnapishtim tells him, "You can't. Immortality was granted to me as a unique exception after the flood. The old world is gone. You're part of the new world, and in the new world, even the children of gods die." The epic is a lament for the loss of the antediluvian world, a recognition that something changed. The bloodlines continue, but they're diluted. The impossible longevity of the pre-flood kings is fading. Archaeological excavations at Uruk confirm massive early dynastic occupation. The city walls attributed to Gilgamesh in myth exist, perimeter walls enclosing over 2,000 acres, among the largest ancient city walls ever constructed. And Gilgamesh's bloodline continues. His son Ur-Nungol succeeds him, then his grandson. The first dynasty of Uruk maintains power for generations before kingship is taken to Ura. Dynasty number 3, the first dynasty of Ura. In southern Mesopotamia, becomes the third major power centre. The king list documents 4 kings of the first dynasty of beginning with Masanapada around 2600 BC. And here's where archaeological confirmation becomes overwhelming. In the 1920s, Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the royal cemetery of 16 royal tombs from the first dynasty period. The wealth was staggering. Gold helmets, lapis lazuli jewellery, musical instruments, and the tombs included human sacrifices, dozens of attendants buried alive with their rulers, apparently walking into the tomb willingly and drinking poison to accompany their king or queen into death. Why would dozens of people willingly die for their ruler? The standard explanation is religious devotion, or cultural obligation, or coercion. But consider another possibility. If you genuinely believed your ruler was semi-divine, carried the blood of the gods, and was going to continue existing in an afterlife where divine blood mattered, then accompanying them might seem like the rational choice. Your status in the next world depends on maintaining your association with the bloodline. Tomb PG 779, the tomb of Queen Puabi, contained her body adorned with an elaborate headdress of gold and lapis, surrounded by 74 attendants. The skeleton of Puabi herself was examined by physical anthropologists. Nothing unusual was found. She was human by all measurable standards. But if the bloodline theory is true, we wouldn't necessarily expect physical differences visible in skeletal remains. We'd expect genetic differences, which we can't test because DNA preservation from 4,600-year-old remains in Mesopotamian soil conditions is essentially zero. What we can observe is the treatment. Rulers of the first dynasty of were treated as fundamentally different from common people. The quantity of resources devoted to their burials, the human sacrifice, the preservation of their genealogies in the king list, all of it speaks to a society that believed bloodline mattered at a metaphysical level. Dynasty number 4, the dynasty of Awan. Awan is more mysterious. It's listed in the king list as a rival power. 3 kings documented, controlling territory in Elam, eastern Mesopotamia, in what's now Iran. The dynasty competed with Kish for supremacy and apparently won for a time before kingship returned west. We haven't definitively located Awan archaeologically. The name appears in later Elamite texts, but the city itself remains unexcavated or unidentified. What matters is that even this rival eastern dynasty is included in the king list. Even foreign conquerors, if they held power over Mesopotamian territory, felt compelled to claim connection to the original bloodlines, or were retroactively incorporated into the genealogical sequence by later scribes. The pattern, legitimate authority, requires genealogical legitimacy. Conquest alone isn't enough. You must connect yourself to the families who carried the original divine mandate. Dynasty number 5. The Dynasty of Lagash. Lagash wasn't a capital in the king list's main sequence, but it's one of the most extensively documented dynasties we have. Why? Because Lagash's rulers left more inscriptions than almost anyone else in Mesopotamian history. The dynasty begins with Ur-Nanshe around 2500 BCE. We have his foundation plaques, his building inscriptions, his victory monuments. His successors, Eonatum, Ennenatum and Temena, all left detailed records of their reigns. Eonatum's Stele of the Vultures, now in the Louvre, commemorates his victory over the rival city of Umma. The inscription describes Eonatum as the seed implanted by Ningirsu, Ningirsu being the city's patron deity, not blessed by Ningirsu, not chosen by Ningirsu, the seed implanted by Ningirsu. Genealogical language. But the most famous ruler of Lagash is Gudea, around 2144-2124 BCE. We have 27 surviving statues of Gudea. We have his massive building cylinders, Cylinder A and Cylinder B, sitting in the Louvre today, over 1400 lines of text total, documenting his divine selection and his reconstruction of Ningirsu's temple. Gudea describes himself as a shepherd chosen by the god. He receives the temple plans in a dream directly from Ningirsu. The text preserves the entire process: the dream, the consultation with a dream interpreter, the gathering of materials from distant lands, the construction itself. And throughout, Gudea emphasizes his genealogy. He connects himself to the earlier rulers of Lagash, documents his parentage, establishes his legitimacy through bloodline. The priest-king model reaches its peak in Lagash. Gudea is simultaneously political ruler and high priest. There's no separation. Divine authority and political authority are unified in a person whose right to both comes from ancestry. Dynasty number 6. The Dynasty of Umma. Umma was Lagash's rival, fighting over the same border territory for generations. Multiple kings of Umma are documented in conflict inscriptions. We know their names because Lagash's kings recorded defeating them, and because Umma's own inscriptions brag about victories over Lagash. Umma claimed divine patronage from the god Shara, son of Inanna. The rivalry between Lagash and Umma wasn't just political, it was theological. Each city claimed its patron deity granted it legitimate authority over the disputed territory. Each claimed its ruling family carried divine mandate through bloodline. The disputes were resolved through warfare, diplomacy, and occasionally through intervention by more powerful kings. But the language used in treaties and boundary stones always emphasized legitimacy through divine connection. You couldn't just claim territory, you had to claim divine right to the territory, which meant claiming the proper bloodline. Dynasty number 7. The Dynasty of Adab. Adab is briefer. 2 kings documented in the king list ruling from central Mesopotamia. One of them, Luguan Mundu, left inscriptions claiming to rule from the Lower Sea to the Upper Sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. That's almost certainly exaggeration, but the claim itself is significant. Why would a minor dynasty claim universal rule? Because legitimate authority in Mesopotamian conception should be universal. The proper king, the one with the correct bloodline, shouldn't rule just one city. He should rule the world. Every dynasty that arose aspired to universal empire, because universal empire is what kingship meant when it first descended from heaven. That ambition, the drive toward universal rule, becomes important when we trace these bloodlines forward. The families who believed they carried divine mandate didn't think small. They thought in terms of world domination, because that's what their ancestry entitled them to. Dynasty number 8, the dynasty of Mari. Mari is fascinating because it sits on the upper Euphrates River in Syria, at the edge of the Mesopotamian world, but Mari's rulers adopted Sumerian culture wholesale. They wrote in Sumerian, worshipped Sumerian gods, and most importantly, claimed descent from the flood survivors. The Royal Archives of Mari, 25,000 cuneiform tablets discovered in the 1930s and still being published today, document one of the most extensively preserved ancient palace administrations we have. The tablets include diplomatic correspondence, economic records, religious texts, and genealogies. Mari maintained its own king lists, claiming continuity with Mesopotamian royal traditions. When more powerful kingdoms conquered Mari, they didn't destroy its archives. They preserved them, because Mari's genealogical records supported their own legitimacy claims. The pattern repeats. Even distant dynasties on the periphery of the Mesopotamian heartland adopted and preserved the bloodline framework. Dynasty number 9, the Akkadian dynasty. In 2334 BCE, everything changes. Sargon of Akkad unifies Mesopotamia by force, creating history's first empire. He conquers from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean, exactly what Lugulan Mundu had only claimed. Sargon's origin story is preserved in legend, born to a priestess who couldn't keep him, set adrift in a basket on the river, raised by a gardener, becoming cupbearer to the king of Kish, overthrowing his master and seizing power. It's the story of an outsider, a man who shouldn't have power according to bloodline. But that's not how Sargon presented himself once he had power. His inscriptions claim divine selection. He presents his rise as fulfillment of divine plan, and crucially, he connects himself to the existing power structure through his position at Kish. He doesn't claim to overturn the system, he claims to restore it after his predecessor failed in his responsibilities. And then his children do something remarkable. Sargon's daughter is Enheduanna, the first named author in human history. She's appointed high priestess of the moon god Nanna at directly connecting the new Akkadian dynasty to one of the 3 most ancient power centres. Her hymns, preserved on multiple tablets, document the divine nature of her family's authority. She describes herself as the spouse of Nanna, creating a direct divine human connection. Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, takes it further. Naram-Sin becomes the first Mesopotamian king to claim full divinity during his lifetime. Previous kings claimed divine descent, divine selection, divine favour. Naram-Sin says, "I am a god." His inscriptions use the divine determinative, the little cuneiform sign that goes before the names of deities, before his own name. He wears the horned crown reserved for gods in Mesopotamian art. His victory stele in the Louvre shows him larger than his soldiers, climbing a mountain, with stars above him representing deities, and he's on the same scale as the cosmic symbols. Temples were built to Naram Sin, offerings made to him, prayers addressed to him. Was it megalomania, or was Naram Sin claiming what he believed his bloodline entitled him to? If the Akkadian dynasty had successfully concentrated the divine blood through marriage alliances with the previous dynasties, and they had, through Enheduanna's position and other documented marriages, then perhaps Naram Sin thought he'd achieved the threshold. Perhaps he believed he'd reconstituted the antediluvian divinity. Whether he was right or delusional, the claim itself is significant. The Akkadian dynasty believed bloodline conferred literal divinity, not just symbolic authority. Dynasty number 10, the Gutian dynasty. The Akkadian Empire falls to invaders from the Zagros Mountains, the Gutians. For 91 years, according to the king list, these mountain peoples control Mesopotamia. 21 Gutian kings are documented. The Sumerian scribes hated them. They call them barbarians, the people who know no inhibitions. Yet they include them in the king list. Why? Because even conquerors needed genealogical legitimacy. The Gutians adopted Mesopotamian royal rituals. They patronized temples. They attempted marriages with surviving members of the previous dynasties. They tried to claim that they, too, carried legitimate authority. They failed. The Gutian period is remembered as chaos and oppression, and the reason they failed is instructive. You can't fake the bloodline. You can conquer territory, but without genealogical connection to the original families, you're always an outsider. Your rule is always contested. When the Gutians are eventually overthrown, it's presented as liberation, the restoration of proper order, the return of kingship to those who rightfully carry it. Dynasty number 11, the third dynasty of Ur. In 2112 BC, Ur-Nammu liberates Mesopotamia from Gutian rule and establishes the third dynasty of Ur, called Ur III by historians. This is the peak of Sumerian civilization, the Golden Age, the moment when all the pieces come together. 5 kings, Ur-Nammu, Shulgi, Amar-Sin, Shu-Sin, Ibi-Sin. 100 years of centralized power, massive building projects, legal reforms, and the most obsessive bureaucracy the ancient world had ever seen. We have 120,000 administrative tablets from the Ur III period. That's not the total, that's what survived. Estimate 1-2% survival rate, and you're looking at 6 million tablets originally. The Ur III state documented everything: grain rations, textile production, livestock inventories, labour assignments, tax collection, and crucially, royal family genealogies. Among the economic records are tablets tracking the royal family itself, Shulgi's children by name, their assignments to provincial governorships, the marriages of royal daughters to secure alliances with local elites, the births of grandchildren extending the bloodline further. The succession is clearly documented: Ur-Nammu to his son Shulgi, Shulgi to his son Amar-Sin, Amar-Sin to his brother Shu-Sin, Shu-Sin to his son Ibi-Sin, father to son, brother to brother, all within the same family, no usurpations, no outside dynasties, 90 years of unbroken bloodline continuity, and both Ur-Nammu and Shulgi claim divinity. Shulgi goes further than anyone since Naram Sin. In royal hymns written in first person, whether he wrote them or commanded their writing, they represent his official claims. Shulgi describes himself as born divine. I, Shulgi, the noble king, since birth have been a hero. The august god, Nana, begot me, not chose me, not blessed me, begot me. Nana is his father. The divine bloodline is explicit. Shulgi rules for 48 years, dying at a very old age for the period. His reign is remembered as the pinnacle of prosperity, and he attributes it all to his ancestry. The Ur III dynasty falls eventually, all dynasties do. Nomadic invasions, internal rebellion, crop failures, the usual cascade of collapse. But the genealogical records are preserved, the bloodline documented so thoroughly that we can trace it forward. Dynasty number 12, the dynasty of Essene. After Ur III falls in 2004 BC, multiple cities compete for supremacy. The dynasty of Essene, founded by Ishbi-Erra in 2017 BC, claims to be the legitimate successor. Ishbi-Erra was a governor under the last Ur III king. When central authority collapsed, he maintained order in his territory and eventually declared himself king. His inscriptions emphasize continuity with Ur III. He claims divine selection. He connects himself genealogically to the previous dynasty through service and possibly through marriage. The records are fragmentary. But later kings of Essene claim descent from both Ishbi-Erra and earlier royal families. 14 kings of Essene ruled across 225 years. They competed with the rival dynasty of Larsa, and both sides justified their claims through genealogy. When Hammurabi of Babylon eventually conquered both around 1763 BC, he too claimed legitimacy by connecting to the previous dynasties. The pattern is unbreakable. Legitimate rule requires genealogical legitimacy. No matter how many times the political map changes, the bloodline claims persist. So those are the 12. Dynasty 1, Kish, the first post-flood capital. Dynasty 2, Uruk, the line of Gilgamesh. Dynasty 3, Ur-I, confirmed by the royal cemetery. Dynasty 4, Awan, the eastern rival. Dynasty 5, Lagash, the priest kings. Dynasty 6, Umma, Lagash's competitor. Dynasty 7, Adab, claiming universal empire. Dynasty 8, Mari, the Syrian outpost. Dynasty 9, Akkad, Sargon's unified empire. Dynasty 10, Gutian, conquerors who tried to claim legitimacy. Dynasty 11, Ur III, the Golden Age. Dynasty 12, Essene, the successors. These 12 dynasties, across 1,000 years, maintained the claim, we rule because of what runs in our blood. We are descended from beings who came from heaven. Kingship descended from heaven twice, before the flood and after, and we carry it forward. Now the question becomes, what happened to them? When Mesopotamian civilization gave way to new empires, the Hittites, the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, did these bloodlines disappear, or did they adapt, migrate and continue? Before we trace them forward, comment below, do you think genealogical claims matter to modern elites? Do you think powerful families today track their ancestry the way these ancient dynasties did? Because we're about to find out. Kingship descends from heaven. We need to talk about that phrase, the one that opens the king list, the one that's repeated after the flood. Because if you're going to understand what these dynasties believed about themselves and what their claimed descendants might still believe today, you need to understand what kingship descended from heaven actually meant. In Sumerian, Nam-lugu an-ta-dada. Let's break it down. Nam-lugu is kingship. Nam is a prefix that turns concrete nouns into abstract concepts, like Ness in English. Lugu is literally big man, the standard Sumerian word for king. So Nam-lugu is kingship, the quality or institution of being king. An-ta is from heaven. An means sky or heaven. Ta is the ablative case suffix indicating motion away from something. So from heaven with emphasis on the source point. DDA is the complicated part, is a verb meaning to go out, to exit, to emerge. D indicates motion toward a destination. A is the past tense or nominalizing suffix. Together, went out and came, or more naturally in English, descended. Put it together, kingship from heaven descended. Now here's what matters, the grammar. This isn't the phrasing you'd use for divine approval or blessing. When Mesopotamian texts want to say a king was chosen by a god, they use PD, selected, picked out. When they want to say a king was beloved of a god, they use kig, in the heart of, loved by. But DD is a motion verb. It's the same verb used in warehouse receipts. Barley from the storehouse descended to the workers. Physical transfer of a material object from point A to point B. When the text was later translated into Akkadian, the scribes used Na in passive form. Was carried down, was brought down, again physical motion. And the phrase is used twice. Once before the flood, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. And once after, when kingship descended from heaven again, kingship was in Kish. That word again, in Sumerian, the suffix but indicates repetition. Kingship descended again. The same thing happened twice. The same external entity, kingship, came from the same source, heaven, through the same process, descent on two occasions separated by the catastrophe. If kingship were just a human institution that received divine blessing, you wouldn't describe its origin this way. You'd say the first king was crowned, or anointed, or chosen. You'd use human political language. But the text treats kingship as something external to humanity, something that exists independent of human society, something that was brought to earth from somewhere else. This is where interpretation diverges. Mainstream scholarship says it's mythological language. The Sumerians were explaining the origin of political authority using their available conceptual framework, which was religious. Descended from heaven means has divine sanction. It's metaphorical. And that's a reasonable interpretation. Lots of ancient societies described human institutions in divine terms. But there's a problem. The Sumerians used metaphorical language all the time, and we can recognize it because they used different grammatical structures. When they wrote poetry, it looks like poetry, full of similes, epithets, repetition, and symbolic imagery. When they wrote hymns, they look like hymns. The king list doesn't read like poetry, it reads like an administrative document. Kings, cities, reign lengths, sequence of succession. The only editorial comment in the entire text is an occasional then kingship was taken to when explaining transitions. Otherwise, it's just data. And in that data-focused context, kingship descended from heaven uses literal motion vocabulary. So here's an alternative interpretation, and we're going to keep it on the table alongside the mainstream view. What if they meant it literally? Not literally in the sense of modern physics and spacecraft, that's imposing our framework on their language, but literally in the sense that they believed kingship wasn't invented by humans. It came from somewhere else. It was brought by someone or something from outside human society. And that external source transmitted not just the idea of kingship, but something physical, a quality, a substance, a genetic element to certain families. Those families became the ruling class. Their children inherited kingship, not because they inherited political connections or wealth, but because they inherited whatever physical substance carried the mandate. In ancient terminology, divine blood. In modern terminology, maybe something genetic. This interpretation explains things the metaphorical reading doesn't fully account for. First, why the obsessive genealogical documentation? If kingship is just divine approval, then each king needs to prove the gods approve of him personally. But if kingship is inherited bloodline, then each king needs to prove his parentage. And what do we see in the records? Obsessive documentation of parentage. Father, mother, grandparents, documented across generations. That's genetic thinking. Second, why fractions of divinity? Gilgamesh being 2/3 divine only makes sense if divinity is quantifiable and inherited. You can't be 2/3 blessed or 2/3 chosen, but you can be 2/3 descended from divine ancestors if your bloodline is mixed. Third, why post-flood decline? The reign lengths dropping from 28,800 years to 1,200 years to 600 years to eventually human parameters suggests dilution, with each generation further from the original divine-human mixture. The divine component weakens. That's how genetics work. Dilution through outcrossing. Fourth, why marriage restrictions? Mesopotamian royal families practiced sibling marriage, half-sibling marriage, and cousin marriage at rates far above the general population. Why? The standard explanation is to keep wealth and power concentrated. But there's another explanation: to keep bloodlines concentrated. If your claim to authority is genetic, you can't afford to dilute the bloodline by marrying commoners. Fifth, why conquerors needed genealogical legitimacy. If kingship were just whoever holds power, then conquest would be sufficient. But every conqueror tried to marry into the previous royal families or claim descent from them. They understood that power without pedigree was unstable. And sixth, why the language is consistent across independent sources. The king list isn't the only text claiming descent from heaven. Royal inscriptions, temple hymns, private letters, economic documents, across thousands of tablets from dozens of cities over 1,000 years, the same concepts appear. Genealogy matters. Divine ancestry is quantifiable. Bloodline determines right to rule. That's not poetic metaphor. That's systematic belief. Now, what was actually descending from heaven? 3 frameworks, same as before. Framework 1, symbolic interpretation. Heaven means divine realm, a spiritual concept. Descent means the gods chose to establish human kingship as their system for organizing society. The early kings were shamans or religious leaders whose spiritual authority evolved into political authority. Divine blood is metaphor for divine favor, transmitted through cultural legitimacy rather than biology. Framework 2, advanced human interpretation. Heaven might refer to the mountains where an advanced pre-flood civilization lived, mountains being literally higher, closer to sky. Descent means that elite refugees from this advanced civilization came down to the Mesopotamian plain after their mountain civilization was destroyed by the flood. They brought sophisticated knowledge, agriculture, mathematics, astronomy, political organization, which seemed divine to the locals. The Sumerians weren't wrong to say kingship came from outside. It did come from outside their society, brought by technological superiors who then intermarried with local populations. Divine blood is the genetic heritage of this advanced human population, possibly conferring actual advantages in intelligence or leadership capacity. Framework 3, non-human intervention interpretation. Heaven means sky in the literal sense. Descent means arrival from space, another dimension or another developmental track on Earth itself. The Anunnaki were non-human intelligences, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or perhaps an advanced terrestrial species that developed parallel to humans. They genetically engineered or hybridized with humans to create a ruling class that would manage civilization according to their design. Divine blood is literal hybrid genetics, mixing human and non-human DNA in ways that conferred unusual abilities and required careful preservation through controlled breeding. Each framework has evidence supporting it and problems with it. What we're documenting is the belief system itself, that these 12 dynasties understood their authority as coming from inherited bloodline connected to non-human or superhuman origins. Whether they were correct, delusional, or encoding something else in genetic sounding language, the belief shaped their behaviour. They documented genealogies obsessively. They married within restricted circles. They treated bloodline as the foundation of legitimate authority. And they passed this system forward. When we trace these 12 bloodlines westward through the Hittites, through Troy, through Rome, through medieval European nobility, to modern royal families and elite dynasties, we're not tracing mythology. We're tracing a system of power based on ancestry. Whether the ancestry actually traces back to non-human origins, or whether powerful families simply claim it does, the result is the same. Bloodline determines position. And if you think that system ended with the ancient world, the next chapter is going to surprise you. The flood as genealogical reset. We need to understand what the flood meant to this system, because the flood isn't just a catastrophe, it's a bottleneck, a genetic bottleneck and a genealogical reset. Multiple Mesopotamian texts describe it. The king list gives it one line, then the flood swept over. The Eridu Genesis, preserved on tablet CBS TO 673 at the University of Pennsylvania Museum, describes the gods deciding to destroy humanity, with Enki warning Ziusudra. The Atrahasis epic, on tablets in the British Museum, gives the most detail. In Atrahasis, humanity has become too numerous and too noisy. The gods can't sleep. They decide to eliminate the problem through a series of catastrophes, plague, drought, and finally flood. But Enki, who was involved in creating humans in the first place, warns his favourite, Atrahasis, whose name means exceedingly wise. Enki tells Atrahasis to build a boat, bring animals, bring his family, bring the craftsmen who know important skills, survive. The flood comes. Everyone else dies. After the waters recede, Atrahasis makes an offering. The gods, who apparently didn't think through the consequences of eliminating their workforce, are delighted by the scent of the sacrifice. They realise they need humans after all. They bless Atrahasis and his family and send them to repopulate the world. The Eridu Genesis is similar. Ziusudra is warned. He survives. He receives immortality and divine status afterward. Now, why preserve this story? What's it actually documenting? On the surface, it's an explanation for the obvious catastrophic floods happened in Mesopotamia. The archaeological evidence is clear. Multiple cities show flood deposits around 2900 BCE. Something big happened. But look at what the story emphasizes. Selective survival. The flood doesn't wipe out humanity randomly. It wipes out everyone except one family. And that family isn't chosen randomly, it's chosen specifically by one of the creator gods. The family that carried the best genetic heritage, the closest connection to the divine human mixing, is preserved intentionally. After the flood, that family becomes the ancestor of all subsequent humanity, or at least all subsequent humanity that matters. The royal families, the ones documented in the king list, all claim descent from the flood survivor. This is genealogical bottleneck thinking. In modern genetics, we understand bottlenecks. If a population crashes and only a few individuals survive, all subsequent genetic diversity comes from those survivors. If you want to trace ancestry in a post-bottleneck population, you trace back to the bottleneck survivors. The flood narrative describes exactly this, just without modern terminology. Before the flood, widespread population with varying degrees of divine ancestry. After the flood, one family carrying the most concentrated divine bloodline. All legitimate post-flood rulers descend from that family. This is why post-flood dynasties claim two sources of authority. First, descent from the pre-flood divine human unions. Through the flood survivor, they maintain genetic connection to the antediluvian world. Second, the renewed descent of kingship from heaven. The king list says kingship descended again after the flood. This suggests the external entities who established kingship originally returned after the catastrophe to re-establish it. The system was rebooted, but it wasn't rebooted randomly. It was rebooted through a carefully preserved bloodline. Now, is this history or mythology? Let's look at what we can verify. First, catastrophic flooding in Mesopotamia around 2900 BC is geological fact. Excavations at Ur, Kish, Shuruppak and other sites found sterile flood deposits between occupation layers. The flood wasn't global, no evidence for that, but it devastated the Mesopotamian heartland. To anyone living there, it would have seemed world-ending. Second, flood narratives are nearly universal across ancient cultures. Not just Mesopotamia, the biblical Noah, the Hindu Manu, the Greek Deucalion, Native American flood myths, Polynesian flood myths. The similarities are striking, divine warning to one righteous man, boat, animals, survival, repopulation. Third, many of these narratives emphasize that the survivors become the ancestors of subsequent nobility. It's not just about humanity surviving, it's about the right humans surviving. The mainstream interpretation, universal folk memory of local flooding events, plus convergent evolution of the myth to explain civilization's origins. The alternative interpretation, these narratives, preserve distorted memory of an actual catastrophic event around 3000–900 BC that disrupted but didn't destroy an earlier advanced civilization. The survivors of that civilization became the ruling class in the post-catastrophe world, and their descendant families preserved the memory of surviving through selective preservation. Either way, what matters for our investigation is how this narrative shaped subsequent behaviour. The post-flood dynasties believed they descended from flood survivors. They documented it, they used it to justify their authority, and they structured their marriage patterns to maintain that ancestral connection. Look at the pattern. Dynasty of Kish claims first post-flood kingship, implying direct connection to survivors. Dynasty of Uruk, Gilgamesh's quest to find Utnapishtim to learn the secret of immortality. The epic treats Utnapishtim as Gilgamesh's distant ancestor, same bloodline, separated by time. Dynasty of Ur, royal genealogies trace back to the first post-flood generations. Dynasty of Mari, explicit claims in Mari texts to descent from flood survivors. Every major dynasty makes the claim, and they don't treat it as poetic or symbolic. They treat it as the legal foundation of their right to rule. When we move forward to later empires, the pattern continues. The Hittites, who conquer Anatolia in the 2nd millennium BC, adopt Mesopotamian myths wholesale, including the flood narrative. Their royal family claims descent from the same sources. The Persians, when they conquer Mesopotamia in 539 BCE, preserve the genealogical records. Cyrus the Great presents himself not as foreign conqueror, but as restorer of legitimate order. His inscriptions honour the Mesopotamian gods and claim the gods chose him to liberate Babylon from its unworthy rulers. He positions himself within the existing legitimacy framework. Alexander the Great, conquering Persia in 331 BC, does the same. He goes to the Temple of Marduk in Babylon and presents himself as Marduk's chosen instrument. He claims connection to the ancient bloodlines through supposed descent from Heracles, who Greek mythology linked to Eastern origins. The pattern is unbreakable. Every conqueror who successfully holds power in Mesopotamia connects himself to the original bloodlines or preserves the records of those bloodlines, and those records are transmitted westward. When the Seleucid Greeks rule Mesopotamia after Alexander's death, they commissioned Berossos, a Babylonian priest, to compile Mesopotamian history in Greek. Berossos writes the Babyloniaca around 290 BC, translating the king list and flood narratives for a Greek audience. This is how Mesopotamian genealogical claims enter the Greek intellectual world and, through Greek influence, reach Rome. Roman patrician families claim Trojan origins. Troy sits in Anatolia, in the Hittite cultural sphere. The Hittites documented marriage alliances with Mesopotamian royal families. We have the tablets. The genealogical chain connects. And here's what's remarkable. When we look at modern genetic studies of European elite populations, we find evidence consistent with these genealogical claims. But before we jump forward to genetics and modern families, we need to establish something crucial. We need to look at what Mesopotamian texts say about how these bloodlines were created in the first place. Because if the flood was a genetic bottleneck preserving certain lineages, we need to understand what made those lineages special. We need to talk about blood, clay, and what the Mesopotamians believed divine essence actually was. Blood, clay, and divine essence. The creation of humanity in Mesopotamian texts isn't like Genesis. There's no "let us make man in our image," followed by dust and breath. The Mesopotamian accounts are procedural. They read like laboratory notes. The Atrahasis epic, which we've already mentioned for its flood account, opens with creation. The text is preserved on multiple tablets in the British Museum, particularly BM 78941. Here's what it describes. In the beginning there were gods, the Anunnaki, and there are lesser gods called the Agigi. The Agigi do all the hard work, digging canals, building cities, maintaining infrastructure. They do this for 2,500 years. Then they revolt. They burn their tools, surround the house of Enlil, the meticulous god, and refuse to work anymore. The gods convene a council. What do? We can't do the work ourselves, we're gods. But the Agigi are right that the labour is unbearable. Enki, the wise god, proposes a solution: create a substitute worker, fashion a new being specifically designed to bear the toil of the gods. The gods agree. But how? The text is specific. One god must be slaughtered. The god chosen is Geshtu-E, whose name means ear or wisdom. He has personality or intelligence. The Akkadian word is Temu. Geshtu-E is killed. His blood is collected. The birth goddess, Nintu, also called Ninma or Beletili in different texts, mixes his blood with clay taken from the Abzu, the underground freshwater ocean that in Mesopotamian cosmology lies beneath the earth. The mixture is then used to form humans. 14 are created, 7 male, 7 female. The text specifies that Nintu pinches off pieces of the mixture and forms them. It says she uses a brick mould, the same tool used for making mud bricks, to give them shape. The creator goddess says, "I have removed your heavy work. I have imposed your toil on man." And then this line you called out for humanity. "I have loosened the bond. I have granted you freedom." The gods celebrate. The Agigi are released from labour. Humans are put to work. The text then specifies the birth process. The divine clay mixture is placed in divine wombs of goddesses serve as surrogates, and after 10 lunar months, humans are born. Now, the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, preserved on 7 tablets, including K5419C in the British Museum, tells a similar but compressed story. After Marduk defeats the primordial goddess Tiamat and creates the cosmos from her body, he addresses the problem of divine labour. Let me put blood together and make bone. Let me set up primeval man, man shall be his name. Let me create a primeval man. The work of the gods shall be imposed on him, so that they may be at leisure. The gods debate whose blood to use. They settle on Kingu, Tiamat's consort, who led her rebellion. Kingu is executed. Ea, Enki's Babylonian, creates humans from his blood. Out of his blood they fashioned mankind. He imposed the service and let free the gods. So we have 2 accounts, separated by centuries and different cities, telling the same basic story. Humans were created deliberately by mixing divine blood with clay. The purpose was to create workers. The method was genetic, mixing divine substance with earthly material. The result was a hybrid, partly divine the blood, partly earthly the clay. Now let's think about what this means for royal bloodlines. If all humans were created from one god's blood mixed with clay, then theoretically all humans have divine ancestry. But the texts specify that only one god was killed. His blood was divided among the clay to create multiple humans. So from the start there's dilution. If Geshtui's blood is divided among 14 humans, each human is maybe 5-10% divine blood, 90-95% clay. But what if some humans maintained higher concentrations? What if the royal families, the ones who became the ruling class, were created with less dilution? Or what if after initial creation certain humans mated with additional Anunnaki, increasing the divine percentage in their bloodlines? This is exactly what other Mesopotamian texts describe. The myth Enki and Ninmah describes creation as trial and error. Multiple versions of humans are created, some defective, some functional, suggesting experimental iteration. The Epic of Gilgamesh explicitly states that Gilgamesh is 2/3 divine, 1/3 human. That ratio only makes sense if divinity is quantifiable and hereditary. Multiple myths describe Anunnaki taking human lovers and producing hybrid offspring. Inanna and Dumuzi, Enlil and various human women, Enki's numerous affairs with mortals. The pattern across texts: humans start with some divine component from creation, but royal families maintain or increase the divine percentage through continued mixing with Anunnaki. This creates a hereditary caste system based on blood percentage. Common humans 5-10% divine from the original creation mixture. Royal families 30-70% divine from continued divine human unions. Semi-divine heroes 50-75% divine like Gilgamesh at 2/3. Full Anunnaki 100% divine. The royal families maintain their status by controlling marriage. Marry within the royal class and you maintain high divine percentage. Marry commoners and you dilute it. This explains the obsessive endogamy, sibling marriage, cousin marriage, restricted marriage pools. They're protecting genetic concentration. Now here's where it gets really interesting. The Atrahasis epic says Geshtu-E was chosen specifically because he had Temu, intelligence, personality, wisdom. His blood carried these qualities. When mixed with clay to create humans, those qualities were transferred. In modern terms, genetic information. Blood carries dinar. Dinar encodes traits. Traits are inherited. The Mesopotamians didn't have the vocabulary of genetics, but they describe something that behaves exactly like genetic inheritance. Qualities carried in blood, passed from parents to children, diluted by outcrossing, concentrated by controlled breeding. Were they describing actual genetics using the conceptual framework available to them? Framework 1, no, it's pure mythology. Blood and clay are symbolic. The divine-human mixture is a metaphor for humans having both material bodies and spiritual consciousness. The royal bloodline claims are social constructs, elite families claiming special ancestry to justify their power. Framework 2, they're describing genetic engineering by an advanced human civilization that preceded the Sumerians. Divine blood means genetic material from this technologically superior population. Clay means baseline human genetics. The mixing describes hybridization or genetic modification. The resulting humans had advantages, intelligence, leadership capacity, longer lifespan, inherited from the divine, actually advanced genetic donors. Framework 3, they're describing literal hybridization between non-human entities and terrestrial humans. Divine blood is non-human DNA. The mixing produced fertile hybrids, uncommon in biology, but not impossible, especially if deliberate genetic engineering was involved. The royal families descend from these hybrids and preserve the non-human genetic component through controlled breeding. What we can say with certainty, the Mesopotamians treated bloodline as biological, not merely social. They documented it with the precision they applied to every other quantifiable resource. And they structured their entire civilization around maintaining specific bloodlines in positions of power. The priest-king system, which we'll examine next, operationalized this belief. Religious authority and political authority were unified in families who claimed biological connection to the divine. Not symbolic connection, biological connection, inherited through blood, documented through genealogy, preserved through controlled marriage. This system didn't end in ancient Mesopotamia. It was transmitted forward, adapted, and arguably continues today in modified form. Before we trace it forward geographically, let's see how it functioned at its peak. The priest-king's double crown. Power in Mesopotamia wasn't divided between church and state. That separation is a modern Western concept that would have made no sense to ancient Mesopotamians. Religious authority and political authority flowed from the same source, bloodline, and they were held by the same people. The priest-king model reaches its clearest expression in Lagash, dynasty number 5 of R12. We need to spend time on this because it demonstrates how the bloodline system actually functioned. This isn't abstract theory, it's documented in thousands of tablets. Nippur was the religious centre of Mesopotamia, not the capital. Kingship moved between cities, but the sacred centre. Nippur was where the temple of Enlil stood. Enlil was, for most of Mesopotamian history, the supreme deity, king of the gods, controller of destinies. Control Nippur's temple, and you have religious legitimacy across all of Mesopotamia. The temple administration at Nippur was hereditary. Specific families held specific offices, passed from father to son across generations. We know this because the Nippur archives, thousands of tablets excavated by the University of Pennsylvania in the late 1800s and early 1900s, document the system in extraordinary detail. One family in particular is extensively documented, the Ur-Mimi family. They held a hereditary prebend, a temple office that came with income, authority and responsibilities at Enlil's temple. A prebend, Didion, functioned like property. You inherited it. You could divide it among your sons. You could, in extreme circumstances, sell it, though that was discouraged. The crucial point: religious offices were owned through bloodline. The Mimi family's records span at least 6 generations, around 2100–1900 BC. Tablets document which family member held which office, how much barley and silver each received as income, which family members substituted for each other during illness or travel, succession disputes resolved by presenting genealogical proof of descent, marriages between the Mimi family and other priestly families, creating alliances. This wasn't about religious calling or spiritual worthiness. This was about inheritance. You could serve as priest because your father was priest, because his father was priest, tracing back to whenever the family first received the prebend. And this system wasn't unique to Nippur. Every major temple in every major city operated the same way. Priestly offices were hereditary. Bloodline determined who could serve the gods. Now, in some cities, religious and political authority was separated. The king ruled politically. The high priesthood ruled religiously. They were different people from different families, but in Lagash they were the same person. Gudea of Lagash, around 2144–2124 BC, held the title Ensi, governor or ruler, but he also functioned as high priest of Ningirsu, Lagash's patron deity. His inscriptions describe both political and religious responsibilities without distinguishing them. We have 27 statues of Gudea surviving in museums around the world. Most show him in a pose of prayerful devotion, wearing a distinctive headdress. The inscriptions on these statues document his temple building, his offerings, his divine communications. The most extensive texts are the Gudea cylinders, Cylinder A and Cylinder B, sitting today in the Louvre. Combined, they contain over 1,400 lines of cuneiform documenting Gudea's reconstruction of the Enunu temple of Ningirsu. The text describes the process. Gudea receives a dream. In the dream, Ningirsu appears and shows him the temple plan. Gudea doesn't fully understand the dream, so he consults a dream interpreter. The interpreter explains Ningirsu has chosen Gudea to rebuild the temple and has revealed the architectural plan. Gudea gathers materials from across the known world: cedar from Lebanon, gold from Egypt, carnelian from Meluhar, possibly the Indus Valley. The text lists everything in accountant's detail, not poetic vagueness, but specific quantities and sources. The temple is built exactly to the divine specifications. Ningirsu is pleased. Gudea is blessed. Throughout the text, Gudea emphasizes his genealogy. He connects himself to earlier rulers of Lagash, Ur-Nanshe, Eannatum-Entemena. He documents his parentage. He establishes that he holds authority through bloodline, not just personal achievement. And crucially, the text describes Gudea's selection in genealogical terms. Ningirsu looked with favour upon the family of Gudea, not on Gudea individually, on his family, his bloodline. The same pattern appears in inscriptions from other priest-kings. Eannatum of Lagash, a generation before Gudea, left the stele of the vultures describing his victory over Umma. The inscription states Eannatum is the seed implanted by Ningirsu in the womb. Seed implanted. That's biological language. Not blessed, not chosen, implanted. As if Ningirsu personally ensured Eannatum's conception. As if the divine bloodline was literal. This brings us to the sacred marriage ritual. In multiple Mesopotamian cities, the king participated in an annual ritual called the sacred marriage Sumerian, Hierosamon. The king, representing Dumuzi the Shep god, ritually mated with the high priestess, representing Inanna, the goddess of love, war and fertility. Mainstream interpretation, sympathetic magic. The ritual ensures fertility of the land by symbolically reenacting the divine marriage. Alternative interpretation, the ritual maintained the divine bloodline. If royal authority derives from divine ancestry, then periodically reintroducing divine genetics or ceremonially affirming the existing divine genetics would strengthen the claim. The high priestess wasn't just representing the goddess symbolically. She embodied the divine feminine, and union with her past divine essence to the king, or confirmed his existing divine nature. We can't prove which interpretation is correct, but we can observe the pattern. Religious ritual, political authority, and bloodline maintenance were inseparable. The king was high priest because his bloodline gave him access to the divine realm. He could mediate between gods and humans because he carried both natures. Politically, this meant his decisions had divine sanction. Economically, it meant temple resources and state resources were managed by the same family. Socially, it meant challenging the king was challenging the gods. The system was totalizing. Bloodline determined everything. And the system was documented obsessively because genealogical proof was legal necessity. If you claimed priestly office, you had to prove descent from the family that owned the prebend. If you claimed kingship, you had to prove descent from previous kings who carried divine ancestry. Thousands of tablets exist, preserved in the dry Mesopotamian soil, excavated over the past 150 years, documenting family trees. Temple archives kept these records alongside economic accounts because they served the same function, proving ownership. You owned land through inheritance, you owned slaves through purchase, and you owned authority through bloodline. When we trace the 12 dynasties forward through time, we're not tracing mythology or vague claims. We're tracing a documented system of hereditary power that operated continuously for over 1,000 years in Mesopotamia before being exported to successor civilizations. The Hittites adopted it, the Persians adopted it, the Greeks under the Seleucids adopted it. The Romans already had a version of it and recognized the Mesopotamian system as compatible with their own patrician bloodline consciousness. And as that system moved west, through conquest, trade, diplomatic marriage, migration, the families carrying it maintained their genealogical documentation. Medieval European nobility's obsession with heraldry, bloodline and succession law isn't a medieval invention. It's the continuation of a system established 5,000 years earlier in Mesopotamia. But before we trace the westward transmission in detail, we need to look at the physical evidence these dynasties left. Because these weren't just claims in texts, these dynasties marked their divine ancestry in stone and seal. They made it public, they made it official, they made it legally binding. Markers in stone and seal. If you were a merchant in ancient Mesopotamia, every contract you signed was sealed. Not sealed with wax, like in medieval Europe, sealed with a cylinder seal rolled across wet clay. Cylinder seals were small stone cylinders, usually an inch or two long, carved with a design in reverse. When rolled across clay, they left a positive impression. Each seal was unique, functioning as a signature. The design identified the seal's owner, and rolling your seal onto a document meant you were legally bound to whatever that document said. For commoners, cylinder seals might show simple scenes, animals, plants, geometric patterns. For elites, seals showed much more, the owner's name in cuneiform, their title, their patron deity, and often a scene of the owner meeting or receiving blessing from that deity. For royalty, cylinder seals were declarations of divine ancestry. The Metropolitan Museum in New York, the British Museum in London, the Louvre in Paris, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Oriental Institute in Chicago, all hold extensive collections of Mesopotamian cylinder seals. And the royal seals follow a consistent pattern. The king stands before a deity. The deity extends symbols of authority, sometimes a rod and ring representing measuring tools, hence justice and order, sometimes a symbolic plant, sometimes a weapon. The scene establishes this king receives his authority from this god. But the postures and proportions are revealing. The king isn't grovelling before a distant, transcendent god. The king and deity are often shown at nearly the same scale. The interaction is direct, sometimes almost casual, and frequently the imagery includes symbols suggesting kinship, the king wearing horned crowns reserved for deities, or divine symbols appearing above the king's head as if claiming identity rather than just favour. Example, Seal of Ur-Nammu, founder of the third dynasty of Ur. The seal shows Ur-Nammu receiving the rod and ring from the moon god Nanna. Ur-Nammu wears the horned crown. He's labelled with the divine determinative, the little cuneiform marker that goes before God's names. This seal was rolled onto official documents, treaties, building dedications, legal decrees. Every time the impression declared, this king is divine. His authority flows from Nanna, his divine father. Now let's look at monuments. Naram Sin of Akkad commissioned the Victory Stele, now in the Louvre, celebrating his conquest of the Lulubi people around 2050 BC. The stele shows Naram Sin ascending a mountain. His soldiers below him defeated enemies at his feet. He's larger than everyone else, scale indicating importance. And he wears the horned crown. Before Naram Sin, that crown appears only on deities in Mesopotamian art. It's how you identify a god in a relief or statue. Count the horns. More horns mean higher rank in the divine hierarchy. Naram Sin puts it on his own head. The inscription calls him God of Akkad, using the divine determinative before his name. Dinaram Sin, not king who serves the gods, not king chosen by the gods, God, full stop. Mainstream history, Naram Sin suffered from hubris. He overstepped. Later Mesopotamian tradition remembered his reign as troubled, rebellions, invasions, disasters, which they attributed to divine punishment for his arrogance. Alternative interpretation, Naram Sin understood what his bloodline actually was. If the Akkadian dynasty had successfully concentrated divine ancestry through his grandfather Sargon's conquest, and his father's marriages to daughters of the old dynasties, and if his aunt Enheduanna's position as high priestess had further confirmed the family's divine status, then maybe Naram Sin reached the threshold. Maybe he had sufficient divine blood percentage to justify the crown and the title. Whether he was right or delusional, the important fact is the claim itself. He didn't claim divine favour, he claimed divine nature. And he proclaimed it publicly on monuments that stood in city centres where everyone could see. And here's what's fascinating. Temples were built to Naram Sin during his lifetime. We have tablets documenting offerings made to the god Naram Sin, prayers addressed to him, petitioning him for protection and blessings. This wasn't private belief. This wasn't metaphor. This was state religion. Official cult worship of the living king as god. Shulgi of Ur, a century later, did the same. Royal hymns composed in his name, whether he wrote them or commissioned them, they represent official claims, describe his divine birth. I, Shulgi, the noble king, was born of the divine. The august god, Nanna, begot me. Begot, past tense of beget, to father a child. Nanna is Shulgi's biological father. These hymns weren't private documents. They were performed in temples. They were copied and recopied by scribal schools. They were official statements of the dynasty's nature. And again, Shulgi's claims weren't rejected by his contemporaries. No rebellion overthrew him for blasphemy. No priests denounced him. The system accepted that sufficiently concentrated divine bloodline conferred divine status. Now let's look at Gudea of Lagash, who we've already mentioned. 27 surviving statues. Most are in the Louvre, with others scattered in museums worldwide. They're all similar, Gudea seated or standing, hands clasped in prayer, wearing a distinctive rounded cap, with inscriptions documenting his piety and temple building. The inscriptions emphasize selection. Ningirsu chose Gudea because of his family line. One text states, "Since the days of old, the god Ningirsu has looked favourably upon the house of Gudea." The house of Gudea, his family, his lineage. Divine favour is genealogical, not individual. Gudea didn't claim full divinity like Naram Sin and Shulgi. He positioned himself as devoted servant, but the distinction might be one of emphasis rather than kind. Gudea's dynasty in Lagash wasn't empire building like Akkad or Ur-3. Lagash was a city-state, and Gudea's strategy for maintaining independence was emphasizing piety rather than power. But the underlying claim is the same. His right to rule flows from his bloodline's connection to the divine. The physical evidence is everywhere, not hidden in esoteric texts, not whispered in secret ceremonies, carved in stone, rolled on legal documents, displayed in public monuments, sung in temple hymns. The ancient Mesopotamians weren't lying about their belief system. They genuinely understood political authority as flowing from divine bloodline. They documented it in every medium available, and they passed that documentation forward. When the Hittites conquered Anatolia, they adopted Mesopotamian artistic conventions, including divine kingship imagery. Hittite king reliefs show kings meeting gods in the same direct manner, receiving authority, wearing divine symbols. When the Persians conquered Mesopotamia, they preserved Mesopotamian monuments. Cyrus the Great didn't destroy Naram Sin's stele. He looted it and moved it to Susa as a prize, recognizing its importance. When Alexander conquered the Persian Empire, he went to Babylon and presented himself at Marduk's temple as the god's chosen instrument. He understood that legitimacy in the region required claiming connection to the ancient divine bloodline framework. And Seleucid kings, ruling after Alexander's death, commissioned Berossos to translate Mesopotamian records into Greek specifically to document their claim to legitimate succession. The system was transmitted westward not as mythology but as constitutional foundation. The right to rule depends on ancestry, and ancestry must be documented, publicly claimed and legally certified. When we look at European heraldry, coats of arms displaying genealogical connections, royal seals showing divine right, coronation ceremonies involving religious anointing, we're seeing the same system, modified, adapted to different cultural contexts, but fundamentally the same. Bloodline determines authority, and authority must be marked and proven. The direct line from Mesopotamian cylinder seals showing kings meeting gods to medieval royal seals showing kings crowned by Christ is traceable. The iconography changed, the names changed, the underlying logic didn't. Now let's look at how that system was maintained with mathematical precision. The mathematics of succession. The third dynasty of Ur, dynasty number 11 of R12, represents the peak of Mesopotamian record-keeping, and that record-keeping gives us unprecedented insight into how bloodlines were actually managed. We have 120,000 administrative tablets from the Ur-3 period. That's not an estimate, that's the count of tablets sitting in museums and university collections today, primarily from excavations at Nippur, Ur, Umma, Drehem, and other Ur III administrative centres. Scholars estimate that surviving tablets represent 1–2% of the original archive. Do the math: if 120,000 is 1%, then the original archive contained 6 million tablets. Even at 2% survival rate, we're talking 3 million original documents. The Ur III state documented everything: grain rations distributed to workers, textile production quotas, livestock transfers between temple herds, beer brewing, bricks manufactured, labour assignments for canal maintenance, tax collection, trade with foreign merchants, and royal family genealogy. Among the economic tablets are documents tracking the royal family itself. Not occasionally, systematically. The system tracked the king's sons and daughters by name in birth order, which wife bore which child, marriages of royal daughters to provincial governors, appointments of royal sons to governorships and military commands, rations allocated to royal family members, births of grandchildren, deaths and succession. Let's trace one lineage in detail. Ur-Nammu founds the dynasty in 2112 BC. His son Shulgi succeeds him in 2094 BC. Tablets document Shulgi's appointment as crown prince before Ur-Nammu's death, establishing clear succession. Shulgi rules for 48 years, an extraordinarily long reign for the period. He has multiple wives and at least 6 documented children. Tablets track his sons' careers. Amar-Sin, the eldest surviving son, one earlier son appears to have died young, is appointed governor of Ur while Shulgi is still alive, training for kingship. Shulgi dies in 2047 BC. Amar-Sin succeeds without dispute. The succession is documented in tablets dated to the transition year. Amar-Sin rules for 9 years. Tablets document his son, but also his brother Shu-Sin being positioned as potential heir. Amar-Sin dies in 2038 BCE. His brother Shu-Sin takes the throne, not his son. Why? The tablets don't explain directly, but succession laws from this period suggest age and capability mattered. If Amar-Sin's son was too young, the kingship would pass to Amar-Sin's brother to maintain stability. Shu-Sin rules for 9 years. Tablets document his son Ibi-Sin's appointments and preparation for rule. Shu-Sin dies in 2029 BCA. Ibi-Sin succeeds, this time father to son again. Ibi-Sin rules until the dynasty falls to Elamite invasion in 2004 BCA. 5 kings, 4 succession events, all documented, all within the same bloodline. No usurpations, no outside dynasties seizing power, 90 years of unbroken family continuity, and the system goes beyond just documenting succession. It actively manages bloodline expansion through marriage. Shulgi's daughters married governors of major cities: Susa, Eshnunna, Anshan. Tablets document the wedding gifts, the dowries, the ongoing relationship between the royal house and these provincial governors now bound by kinship. Why marry daughters to governors? Standard explanation: political alliance. Governors bound to the king through marriage are less likely to rebel, but there's a genetic explanation too: spreading the royal bloodline. Each princess marrying a governor produces children who carry royal blood. Those children hold positions of influence in their provinces. Over generations, you create a network of interrelated families, all carrying royal ancestry, all with interests aligned to maintaining the system. It's not just about loyalty, it's about creating a genetic web. Calculate, if Shulgi has 6 children, and each of them has 6 children, that's 36 grandchildren. If each grandchild has 6 children, that's 216 great-grandchildren. Over 4 generations, a single king produces hundreds of descendants if the family is strategically managing reproduction. Now, most of those descendants aren't kings, but they're all royal family. They fill the officer corps, they run provincial administrations, They serve as temple officials. They marry into local elite families, spreading royal ancestry further. Within 3 or 4 generations, every elite family in the empire has some royal blood. The distinction between royal and noble becomes a matter of degree, not kind, and the entire system depends on documentation, because your position in society, your access to office, your marriage prospects, your economic rights, depends on proving your genealogy. This is why temple archives preserved family records alongside economic records. They served identical functions, proving ownership. You owned land through inheritance, documented in legal tablets. You owned authority through bloodline, documented in genealogical tablets. And the standards of documentation were high. Mesopotamian scribes didn't accept vague oral tradition. They wanted names, relationships, dates. They cross-referenced records. They maintained multiple copies in multiple archives for redundancy. When we say these bloodlines were documented, we're not talking about medieval chronicles written centuries after the fact. We're talking about contemporary administrative records created in real time as part of normal bureaucratic function. The same scribes who recorded that 4,823 sheep were transferred from Nippur to Drehem in month 3 of year 7 of Shulki also recorded that Prince Amar-Sin was appointed governor of Ur in year 12 of Shulki. Same archive. Same documentary standards. This is why the bloodline claims are historically significant, even if we're uncertain what the bloodlines ultimately represent. Whether divine human hybrids or advanced human descendants or simply social constructions, the system for tracking and maintaining them was real, extensive and effective. And the system didn't end with Ur III's fall. The dynasty of Isin, which succeeded Ur III, maintained the same documentary practices. The Old Babylonian period following Isin continued it. The system was inherited by the Kassites, the Assyrians, the Neo-Babylonians, the Persians. When we get to genetic evidence in later chapters, this documentary foundation matters. We're not relying on vague myths. We're working from thousands of tablets documenting specific families across specific time periods. When we find genetic evidence of Near Eastern admixture in European elite populations, we can potentially match it to specific dynasties, because those dynasties documented themselves so thoroughly. But before we jump to genetics and modern families, we need to address something that makes many people uncomfortable. We need to talk about what the texts say regarding how these bloodlines were established. We need to talk about divine human unions, not as metaphor, but as what the texts actually claim. Divine human unions, the texts, and 3 interpretations. This is where the investigation gets difficult, not because the evidence is weak, the evidence is abundant, but because the claims the evidence makes are extraordinary, and extraordinary claims require careful analysis. We're going to look at what Mesopotamian texts actually say about unions between Anunnaki and humans. Then we're going to present 3 interpretive frameworks for understanding those claims. All 3 will be presented fairly, because we can't prove which is correct. What we can prove is that the ancient Mesopotamians believed these unions occurred, documented them extensively, and structured their entire civilization around the resulting bloodlines. What the texts say. Multiple Sumerian and Akkadian texts describe marriages or sexual unions between Anunnaki and humans, not symbolic unions representing abstract concepts, specific narratives with specific characters, specific offspring, specific genealogical consequences. The myth Inanna and Dumuzi describes the goddess Inanna marrying Dumuzi, identified as a shepherd and king of Uruk. The text presents this as a problematic relationship. Inanna's family doesn't approve of her choosing a shepherd, but ultimately they marry. The sacred marriage ritual in multiple Mesopotamian cities reenacted this union annually, with the king playing Dumuzi and the high priestess playing Inanna. Enlil and Ninlil describes Enlil pursuing Ninlil. Some versions present Ninlil as a goddess from the start, but other versions suggest she was human or semi-divine before union with Enlil elevated her status. Their union produces Nanna, the moon god. The Epic of Gilgamesh states explicitly that Gilgamesh's mother is Ninsun, a goddess, and his father is Lugalbanda, the previous king of Uruk, who was human or semi-divine. The text is clear: 2/3 of him is God, 1/3 of him is human. That fraction is mathematically specific. If his mother is 100% divine, and his father is 50% divine, Gilgamesh is 75% divine, close to 2/3 by Sumerian approximation. Alternatively, if his mother is 100% divine, and his father is 33% divine, Gilgamesh is approximately 67% divine, exactly 2/3. The point: the text treats divinity as quantifiable and inherited. It's genetic reasoning. Genesis 6001:4 provides a cross-cultural parallel. When men began to multiply on earth and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw how beautiful the daughters of men were, and they took wives from among those that pleased them. The Nephilim appeared on earth in those days as well as. Later, after the sons of God had intercourse with the daughters of men, who bore them sons, they were the heroes of old, the men of renown. This text comes from Hebrew tradition, not Mesopotamian, but the structure is identical. Divine beings of God mate with human women of En. The offspring are distinct from normal humans, Nephilim, meaning fallen ones or giants. These offspring become the heroes of old, the men of renown, the legendary figures, the founding dynasties. The text places this before the flood, just as the Sumerian king list places divine human mixing before the flood. Greek mythology is full of heroes born from divine human unions: Heracles, Zeus and Alcmene, Perseus, Zeus and Dana, Achilles, Peleus and the sea goddess Thetis, Helen of Troy, Zeus and Leda. Every major Greek hero claims divine parentage. Norse mythology, the Sagods intermarry with human royal families. The Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in 1220 C, explicitly states in its prologue that Odin and the Sur came from Anatolia/Troy. That man is named Odin. He was a far-famed man in Turkland. He made ready to journey out of Turkland. Snorri presents the Norse gods as ancient kings who migrated north and were later deified. Their descendants became Scandinavian royalty. This isn't covert knowledge, it's in the official royal mythology. Hindu tradition, the Rig Veda, and epic literature describe devas producing children with human royalty. The Ikshvaku dynasty claims descent from Surya. The Yadu dynasty claims descent from Chandra. The pattern is global. Ancient cultures describe divine human mixing, producing hero dynasties who become ruling classes. Now, how do we interpret this pattern? Framework 1. Pure mythology. Position. These narratives are symbolic, not historical. Divine human unions represent the metaphorical union of spiritual authority and political power. Reasoning. Gods are personifications of natural forces or psychological archetypes, not actual entities. Divine blood is metaphor for spiritual legitimacy, not biological inheritance. Fractions like 2/3 divine represent spiritual qualities, not genetic percentages. The narratives encode theological claims about the nature of kingship. Kings mediate between human and divine realms, so mythology presents them as literally bridging the two. Cross-cultural similarities reflect universal human psychology. Every society needs origin stories explaining why certain families rule. Strengths of this framework: fits modern secular worldview, explains patterns without requiring supernatural entities, consistent with scholarly consensus on mythology. Weaknesses of this framework: doesn't explain why genealogies were documented with legal precision if bloodline was symbolic, doesn't explain why legal disputes were resolved through genealogical proof, doesn't explain why marriage patterns were restricted if bloodline was metaphorical, doesn't explain the procedural, non-mythological language of creation accounts, doesn't explain fractional divinity expressions, that only make sense mathematically, doesn't explain why the system persisted for thousands of years across multiple civilizations if it was arbitrary. Framework 2. Advanced human civilization. Position: Anunnaki were not supernatural, but technologically/culturally advanced humans. Divine blood represents genetic heritage from this advanced population. Reasoning: before the Seer 2900 BC flood, an advanced human civilization existed in Mesopotamia or nearby regions. This civilization had sophisticated knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, metallurgy, genetics. The catastrophic flood around 2900 BC destroyed much of this civilization, but some survived. Survivors relocated to Mesopotamian plain and became ruling class over less advanced populations. To those populations, the survivors seemed divine. They had knowledge and abilities far beyond common experience. Descended from heaven might mean came from the mountains where they survived the flood, or brought knowledge that seemed heaven-sent. Divine blood is genetic heritage from this technologically superior population, possibly conferring actual advantages in intelligence, health, or leadership capacity. Royal families genuinely descend from this advanced population and preserve the genetic heritage through controlled marriage. The genealogical documentation is accurate history, just using religious vocabulary. Strengths of this framework explains obsessive genealogical documentation, royal ancestry being preserved, explains genetic evidence of Near Eastern admixture in elite populations, actual ancient population movements, explains global similarity of flood plus hero myths, simri of real catastrophe, explains why mythology contains surprisingly accurate astronomical and geographical information, explains why conquerors needed to claim genealogical connection relating to genuinely superior ancestral population, requires no supernatural elements. Weaknesses of this framework: no clear archaeological evidence for pre-Sumerian advanced civilization in Mesopotamia. Advanced civilization should leave architectural remains, metal artifacts, or other durable traces. If such civilization existed, where did it come from originally? Doesn't fully explain impossible antediluvian reign lengths unless they're coded differently than we understand. Framework 3. Non-human intervention. Position: texts should be read more literally. Anunnaki were non-human intelligences, extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or advanced non-human terrestrial species. Divine blood is non-human genetic material. Reasoning: consistent textual claims across multiple independent cultures describing beings who came from the sky. Sumerian word Anunnaki literally means those who from heaven to earth came heaven, ki to earth, no to come. Physical descriptions in texts sometimes distinguish Anunnaki from humans. taller, radiant, extraordinarily long-lived. Creation accounts Trusses and Umaylul describe human creation through mixing divine blood with clay, reads like genetic engineering documentation. Divine human unions describe interbreeding between species or genetic manipulation to create hybrid populations. Royal families descend from these hybrids and preserve the non-human genetic component through controlled breeding. The obsessive genealogical documentation isn't paranoia or status seeking. These families know what's in their blood and why it matters. Antediluvian reign lengths might reflect actual longevity of hybrid individuals before genetic dilution. The system persists because it's real. Modern elite families are aware of their hybrid ancestry and maintain it intentionally. Strengths of this framework: takes ancient texts at face value rather than assuming ancient peoples were confused or lying. Explains astronomical knowledge appearing suddenly in Sumerian civilization. Explains why texts use procedural rather than poetic language for creation. Explains fractional divinity 2/3 as literal hybrid percentages. Explains global pattern of similar myths as global reality rather than coincidence. Explains why bloodline obsession continues in modern elite families despite loss of political power. Weaknesses of this framework: extraordinary claim requiring extraordinary evidence, which isn't available. No physical evidence, no spacecraft, no alien artifacts, no preserved alien bodies. Interspecies breeding typically impossible biologically, though possibly achievable through genetic engineering. Conflicts with evolutionary biology's understanding of human origins. Requires accepting non-human intelligence interacted with humanity, which has massive implications. Maintaining ambiguity. We cannot definitively prove which framework is correct based on ancient texts alone. What we can prove: ancient Mesopotamians treated bloodline as biologically real, not symbolic. They documented genealogies with legal precision across centuries. Political and religious authority were unified in families claiming divine ancestry. The system was maintained through controlled marriage. Multiple independent cultures describe similar patterns. The system was transmitted westward through documented channels. Modern elite families maintain genealogical consciousness and preferential marriage patterns, whether divine blood means. Symbolic legitimacy: 1. Advanced human genetics. Or non-human hybrid genetics. 3. The result is the same. Specific bloodlines held power then and claim descent to power now. What we're investigating is the system itself, how it was established, how it was maintained, how it was transmitted, and whether it continues operating today. The next chapter traces the westward transmission. We'll follow documented genealogies and genetic evidence from Mesopotamia through the Hittites to Troy, from Troy to Rome, from Rome to medieval Europe, and from medieval Europe to modern royal and elite families. We'll present the evidence and let you decide what the bloodlines ultimately represent. The Western thread, Mesopotamia to Europe. This is where documentation meets genetics, where ancient texts meet modern dinar studies, where mythology meets measurable reality. We're going to trace the 12 Mesopotamian bloodlines westward through time and space, using 3 types of evidence: historical texts documenting genealogical claims, archaeological evidence of cultural transmission and political alliances, modern genetic studies showing ancient admixture patterns, The chain connects Mesopotamia Hittites, Troy Rome, medieval Europe, modern elite families. Each link is documented. The question is whether the documentation is accurate. Link 1, Mesopotamia to Hittites. The Hittite Empire controlled Anatolia Turk from approximately 1600–1180 BC. Their capital was Hattusha, extensively excavated, with thousands of tablets recovered. The Hittites didn't develop independently. They were Indo-European migrants who conquered indigenous Anatolian populations and then adopted Near Eastern civilization wholesale. Their religion, their political structure, their literary traditions all borrowed heavily from Mesopotamia. But the connection was deeper than cultural borrowing. It was genealogical. Tablet Kabo I-10, excavated at Hattusha and now in the Berlin museums, documents a marriage alliance between Hittite King Suppiluliuma I's daughter and Babylonian King Burnaburiash II around 1340 BCE. This wasn't a minor diplomatic marriage, it was royal houses uniting bloodlines. Tablet Cub III 37 documents another marriage, a Hittite prince marrying a Kassite princess around 1400 BCE. These weren't isolated incidents. The Amarna letters, diplomatic correspondence from the 14th century BC, discovered in Egypt and now in various museums, document extensive marriage networks among Bronze Age royal families. Hittite royalty intermarried with Babylonian, Assyrian, Mitanni, and Egyptian royal families. Why? Standard interpretation, political alliance. But genetic interpretation, maintaining bloodline concentration. If multiple royal families all descend from the original Mesopotamian dynasties and all believe divine blood matters, then intermarrying maintains that blood while creating political networks. The Hittites documented their own royal genealogies. Hittite king lists survive, showing father-son succession with occasional brother succession. The Hittite royal family claimed divine favour through the storm god, but their adoption of Mesopotamian myths, including the Gilgamesh epic, translated into Hittite, suggests they understood themselves as connected to the broader Near Eastern divine kingship framework. By 1400 BC, Hittite royal blood mixed Mesopotamian bloodlines from multiple dynasties through documented marriage alliances. Link 2, Hittites to Troy. Troy, called Walusa in Hittite texts, possibly Ilion/Ilium in later Greek, sat on the northwestern coast of Anatolia. The site was excavated by Heinrich Schliemann starting in 1871, confirming that Homer's Troy was a real city. The Alexandru Treaty, a Hittite tablet from around 1280 BC, documents a treaty between the Hittite king Mu'atali II and Alexandru of Walusa Troy. The treaty establishes Troy as a Hittite vassal state, politically subordinate but culturally connected. Being a Hittite vassal meant Trojan royalty participated in the broader Hittite cultural sphere. This included diplomatic marriages, cultural exchange, and likely religious practices. The Trojan royal family, as depicted in Homer's Iliad, reposed around 750 BC, but describing Bronze Age events around 1200 BC, includes King Priam and his sons, including Hector and Paris. Homer presents them as allied with various Anatolian peoples, all part of the Hittite sphere. After Troy's destruction, genealogical Troy the Aya destruction layer dated to approximately 1180 BC, consistent with Greek tradition, survivors allegedly fled. Roman tradition claims Aeneas, a Trojan prince, escaped with followers and eventually reached Italy. Is that true? We can't prove it definitively, but we can observe, first, Troy the Aya was destroyed violently, but destruction doesn't mean total extinction. Some population likely survived or fled. Second, archaeological evidence shows late Bronze Age migration throughout the Mediterranean after 1200 BC, as the Bronze Age civilization collapsed. The sea peoples mentioned in Egyptian records were migrants raiders from the Aegean and Anatolia. Population movements happened. Third, genetic evidence shows Near Eastern admixture in Mediterranean populations, with timing consistent with Bronze Age migrations. Fourth, Roman tradition preserved the Trojan origin claim for a millennium. That's a long time to maintain a completely fabricated origin story, especially when Rome was powerful enough it didn't need invented legitimacy. Link 3. Troy to Rome. Roman foundation mythology centers on Aeneas, Trojan prince, son of Anchises, and Venus. Notice the divine human parentage, exactly like Gilgamesh. Virgil's Aeneid, composed 2919 BC, details Aeneas' journey from Troy to Italy, his wars with local tribes, and his establishment of the settlement that would become Rome. Virgil wrote this as pro-Augustus propaganda. Augustus claimed descent from Aeneas through the Julian family. But Virgil wasn't inventing the claim. Julius Caesar's family had claimed descent from Aeneas and Venus for centuries before Virgil. The claim predates Rome's imperial period. Other Roman patrician families made similar claims. Gens Claudia claimed descent from Clausus, a Sabine who allegedly descended from Trojan refugees. Gens Aemilia claimed descent from Aemilos, son of Ascanius, Aeneas's nun. Multiple families claimed Trojan origins directly or through Aeneas's companions. Livy's Ab Urbi Condita, History of Rome, from its foundation, written 27-9 BCE, treats Trojan origins as historically accepted, not as poetic fancy, but as documented tradition. And wealthy Romans visited Troy. Augustus rebuilt the city of Ilion in the 1st century BC, honouring it as his ancestral homeland. This wasn't symbolic. He spent resources maintaining connection to claimed ancestry. Why would Romans claim Trojan origins? Standard interpretation, seeking legitimacy by connecting to the prestigious Greek mythological world, but wanting to be distinct from Greeks, since Rome often fought Greece. Alternative interpretation, the claim was genuine, or genuinely believed. Trojan refugees had reached Italy and intermarried with local Italic tribes, and their descendants became the Roman patrician class. The divine bloodline claims transferred from Troy via Hittite Mesopotamian connection to Rome. Genetic evidence shows this is plausible. Link 4. Rome to medieval Europe. When Rome fell in 476 CE, political continuity broke, but genealogical consciousness didn't. Germanic kingdoms that succeeded Rome adopted Roman legitimacy frameworks. They claimed Roman authority, used Roman titles, and crucially claimed descent from Rome. The Franks, who would dominate medieval Europe, claimed they originated from Troy. Fredegar's Chronicle, Seven Truths, states Franks descended from Francio, son of Priam, Ting of Troy. When Troy fell, Francio led refugees to the Rhine region, where they became the Frankish people. The Liber Historia Francorum 8.3 repeats this claim. Gregory of Tours' Historia Francorum 6th century documents the Merovingian dynasty's genealogy, presenting it as factual history. Why would Germanic tribes claim Trojan origins? Standard interpretation, copying Roman prestige. If Romans claimed Trojan descent, and Romans were prestigious, then claiming the same descent confers legitimacy. Alternative interpretation, the Franks genuinely descended from the same Mediterranean Anatolian migration that produced Roman patricians, or they intermarried with Roman families who carried those genealogies, or both. The Merovingian dynasty ruled the Franks from 481-751 CE. They were overthrown by the Carolingians Shamli, but Carolingians married into Merovingian lines, maintaining genealogical continuity even while changing dynasty names. The Habsburg family, which would dominate Europe from 1282-1918 C, traced ancestry through multiple medieval noble lines, all of which claimed ultimate descent from Merovingians and thus from claimed Trojan Roman origins. The British royal family traces through Anglo-Saxon kings who claimed descent from Woden Odin. The Prose Ed of Roy Sturluson, 1220 C, explicitly places Odin's origin in Anatolia Troy before his migration north. So we have documentation, European nobility claiming Eastern origins through Troy, and ultimately connecting to the Near East. Is the documentation accurate? Let's look at genetics. Genetic evidence, Near Eastern admixture in European elite populations. Study 1, Olaude et al., 2018, Nature the Beaker Phenomenon and the Genomic Transformation of Northwest Europe. Finding the Bell Beaker culture 2800-1800 introduced haplogroup R1b into Western Europe from the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Significance: R1b originated between the Black and Caspian Seas, spread through Anatolia and the Caucasus during the Bronze Age, and then reached Europe. R1b is now the most common Y chromosome haplogroup in Western Europe, 80-90% in Ireland, Wales, Basque Country. Elite concentration: R1b appears at higher frequencies in documented noble families than in general populations. Interpretation: Bronze Age population movement from Near East Caucasus region into Europe, with particular concentration in elite lineages, consistent with an elite migration or conquest establishing itself as ruling class. Study 2, Gretzinger et al. 2024, Nature Genetics. Ancient Dinar reveals admixture history in prehistoric Aegean. Finding: Celtic Hallstatt period 800-450 elite burials show 37% carried haplogroup G2A L497. Significance: G2A L497 originated in the Caucasus Near East during the Bronze Age. Its presence at 37% in Celtic elite burials, much higher than general population, indicates Near Eastern ancestry concentrated in ruling class. Interpretation: Celtic nobility, ancestors of many medieval European noble houses, carried Near Eastern genetic markers at elevated frequency, consistent with migration of elite bloodlines from Near East into Europe. Study 3, Martiniano et al., 2017, Current Biology, the Population Genomics of Archaeological Transition in West Iberia. Finding: Bronze Age Anatolia, including Troy elite burials, show haplogroup R1b Z2103 at 41% frequency, viz. 8% in non-elite burials. Significance: elite families in Bronze Age Anatolia carried specific genetic markers distinct from commoners. These same markers appear in later European elite populations. Interpretation: genetic stratification existed in Bronze Age Anatolia. Elites and commoners had measurably different ancestry. When elites migrated, including potential Trojan refugees, they brought distinctive genetic signatures that appear in later European nobility. Study 4, Haber et al. 2020, Cell, A Genetic History of the Near East, from Neolithic to the Present. Finding: haplogroup EV13 in Balkans, Greece, Italy, traces to Near East Kimin 9,000 years ago. Shows higher frequency in Mediterranean elite populations. Interpretation: long-term connection between Near Eastern populations and Mediterranean elites, consistent with ancient migration and continued intermarriage within elite networks. Study 5, King et al. 2011, Current Biology, Genetic Signatures of Coancestry within Surnames. Finding: British aristocratic surnames show significantly higher Y chromosome sharing than random population. Significance: elite families maintain genetic cohesion over centuries through preferential intermarriage, created traceable genetic lineages preserved across time. Interpretation: bloodline consciousness shaped marriage patterns, producing measurable genetic distinctiveness in aristocratic families. Synthesis: what the genetics show. The genetic studies demonstrate Bronze Age migrations brought Near Eastern ancestry into Europe. This ancestry concentrated in elite populations, not uniformly distributed. Elite families maintained genetic cohesion through restricted marriage over thousands of years. Specific haplogroups R1b, G2a, EV13 show elevated frequency in documented noble lineages. The timing matches Bronze Age 3000-1200 admixture with continued endogamy preserving it. This doesn't prove the genealogical claims are accurate in every detail, but it demonstrates the claims aren't pure fantasy. European elite families do carry measurable Near Eastern ancestry from the Bronze Age, concentrated through preferential marriage. If the 12 Mesopotamian bloodlines transmitted westward through the Hittites, through Troy, through Rome, through medieval nobility, we'd expect exactly this pattern: Near Eastern genetic markers concentrated in European elite families preserved through endogamy. And that's what we find, connecting the 12 to modern families. Can we connect specific modern families to specific ancient dynasties? With certainty, no. The genealogical chains have gaps, name changes, and uncertainty. But we can trace probable connections. British royal family, Windsor, Hanover, Brunswick, Welsh, Saxon, Germanic tribes claimed Odin ancestry, Odin's claimed Anatolian origin. Hittite cultural sphere, Hittite Mesopotamian marriage alliances documented in Cabo Y10. Cub 337, probable connection to Akkadian 9 or Ur-3 dynasty 11 through Babylonian intermarriage. Genetic evidence, British aristocracy shows elevated R1b consistent with Bronze Age Anatolian Near Eastern origins. Spanish Bourbons. Bourbon, Capet, Carolingian, Merovingian, Frankish nobility claim Trojan origins Troy as Hittite vassal Hittite Mesopotamian connection probable, connection to Uruk dynasty II or Babylon dynasties. Genetic evidence, Bourbon haplogroup confirmed as R1b DF27 Hamuso et al. 2013, consistent with Near Eastern Bronze Age origins. Habsburg family. Habsburg Eticonid Merovingian, connections Trojan claims same pathway as above. Genetic evidence, Habsburg descendants show elevated Near Eastern markers, et al. 2018. Rothschild family. Jewish Kohanim tradition claims priestly descent from Aaron 13th century BC, traditional dating. Genetic studies, Neyui Kiki et al. 1997, Thomas et al. 2000 show Cohen model haplotype J1P58 at 46% in Ashkenazi Kohanim, 56% in Sephardic Kohanim, suggesting common ancestor near to 3,000 years ago. J1P58 originated in Levant, Mesopotamia. If Levite priesthood incorporated Mesopotamian priestly traditions, feasible given Mesopotamian influence throughout ancient Near East, this connects to hereditary priest families documented at Nippur and Lagash, #5, priest-king model. Modern Rothschild family maintains genealogical consciousness and strategic marriage patterns similar to ancient priest families. Rockefeller family. German Protestant origins, but genealogical research, New England Historic Genealogical Society, 1990s, connected to Rockefeller family hench nobility, Languedoc, 12th century plus. Roquefeuille connected through intermarriage to Carolingian nobility, Merovingian connections, claimed Trojan origins, Mesopotamian connection. Genetic markers, likely R1b, not Bloodlines, consistent with French noble origins. Pattern across families. Every major European royal house traces genealogically to medieval Germanic, Frankish nobility. Claimed Trojan origins. Troy documented as Hittite vassal state. Hittites documented marrying Mesopotamian royalty, Mesopotamian dynasties, banking and industrial dynasties either, directly descend from European nobility with same connections, or rapidly integrated through intermarriage within 1-2 generations of wealth accumulation. Elite networks today show genetic evidence of shared ancient ancestry, elevated Near Eastern Bronze Age markers, maintained through endogamy, referential marriage within elite networks. The genealogical documentation, whether wholly accurate or partially constructed, preserves memory of connection to ancient Near East and ultimately to Mesopotamian dynasties documented in the king list. We've traced westward transmission, but the pattern appears eastward too. Persia, India, China all developed divine kingship systems with remarkable similarity to Mesopotamia. Independent development or diffusion from common source? We'll examine the eastern paths next, before bringing everything together in the modern era. The eastern paths, Persia, India, and beyond. The westward transmission to Europe is documented extensively. But what about east? Did the 12 bloodlines spread only west, or did they branch east as well? The answer is complex, because Eastern civilizations developed their own divine kingship systems. The question is whether these systems emerged independently, or whether they reflect transmission from a common Mesopotamian source, or even from a more ancient common origin. Let's examine 3 major Eastern civilizations: Persia, India, and China. Persia, direct adoption. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, he didn't destroy Mesopotamian civilization, he absorbed it. The Cyrus cylinder, now in the British Museum, number BM 9092, is a clay cylinder inscribed with Cyrus's proclamation. The text claims, Marduk Babyloni chose Cyrus to liberate Babylon from its unworthy king Nabonidus. Cyrus is restoring proper order, not conquering foreign territory. Cyrus will honour all gods and maintain all temples. This isn't a conqueror speaking. This is a claimant to legitimate succession speaking. Cyrus positions himself within the Mesopotamian legitimacy framework. The Behistun inscription, carved into a cliff face in western Iran around 520 BC by Darius I, documents the Achaemenid royal genealogy: I am Darius, great king, king of kings, king of Persia, son of Hystaspes, grandson of Arsames, Achaemenid, king of kings. That's a Mesopotamian title. The Assyrian and Babylonian kings used it to claim supremacy over vassal kingdoms. Darius adopts it, connecting himself to Mesopotamian imperial tradition. The inscription also claims divine favour from Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity in Zoroastrian religion, but the structure mirrors Mesopotamian royal inscriptions, genealogy plus divine selection plus right to rule. Did the Achaemenid dynasty carry Mesopotamian bloodlines? Directly, unclear. The Persian royal family's origins are obscure before Cyrus. Indirectly, very likely. Cyrus married Cassandane, daughter of a Median king. The Medes had ruled Mesopotamia before the Persians. Cyrus's son, Cambyses II, married a daughter of the last Babylonian king, Nabonidus, directly connecting Persian and Mesopotamian royal blood. Over 200 years of Persian rule over Mesopotamia, 539-331 BC, Persian nobility intermarried with Mesopotamian elite families. By the time Alexander conquered Persia, The Persian aristocracy had absorbed Mesopotamian genealogical claims. The Persian system maintained hereditary nobility, with families tracing ancestry and documenting pedigrees. The system resembles Mesopotamian practice, suggesting either independent development of similar structures or adoption of Mesopotamian templates. India, parallel structure. Indian civilization developed divine kingship claims remarkably similar to Mesopotamia, despite minimal direct contact during the relevant periods. The Vedic texts, approximately 1500–500, describe divine ancestors of royal families. The Solar Dynasty, founded by Ikshvaku, son of Manu, the flood survivor. Notice flood survivor as ancestor of post-flood royalty, exactly like Zusudra in Mesopotamia. Descendants include Rama, hero of the Ramayana epic. Claim, descent from Surya, the sun god. The Lunar Dynasty, founded by Yayati, descended from Chandra, the moon god. Descendants include Krishna and the Pandavas, Mahabharata. Claim, divine blood maintained through generations. Both lineages emphasize divine human mixing before catastrophe. Flood survivor as genealogical bottleneck. Post-flood dynasties claiming descent from divine ancestors. Bloodline purity maintained through controlled marriage. Obsessive genealogical documentation, the epics, contain extensive family trees. Fractional divinity concepts, various heroes described as partially divine, like Gilgamesh's 2/3. The Kshatriya caste, Rory rule, claims special divine ancestry, distinguishing them from other castes. The caste system itself functions as formalized bloodline stratification. You inherit your position based on parentage, not achievement. The parallels to Mesopotamia are striking. Flood plus selective survival plus divine ancestry, post-flood royal dynasties claiming special blood hereditary caste system, obsessive genealogical documentation. 3 interpretations. Interpretation 1. Convergent evolution. Independent societies develop similar legitimacy structures because kingship requires justification. Claiming divine ancestry is universal political strategy. Problem: the specific structural parallels, fractional divinity, bloodline obsession are oddly consistent for independent invention. Interpretation 2. Diffusion from Mesopotamia. The Indus Valley Civilization 3300–1300 had trade contact with Mesopotamia. Archaeological evidence includes Indus seals found in Mesopotamian sites and vice versa. Cultural exchange, including religious and political concepts, is plausible. The Vedic peoples Olo-Europeans, related to the same steppe populations that moved into Europe, arrived in India around 1500 BCA. They may have carried concepts from the Near East or encountered them through trade. Problem: direct evidence of transmission is limited. The similarities could still be coincidental. Interpretation 3. Common ancient source. Both Mesopotamian and Indian traditions preserve distorted memories of a more ancient predecessor civilization that established the bloodline system globally before catastrophic collapse around 3000–2900 BCE. Fragments of that system survived in multiple regions, producing parallel but independent traditions. Problem: no archaeological evidence for such a pre-Sumerian global civilization. Genetic evidence provides some insight. Haplogroup R1a, common in Indian high caste populations, particularly Rawn, originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the same region that produced R1b that spread into Europe. Both haplogroups appear elevated in elite populations of their respective regions. This suggests Bronze Age migrations from the steppe carried related populations to both Europe and India. If those populations carried cultural traditions including divine kingship concepts, transmission of similar systems is plausible. But we can't prove it definitively. What we can observe, India developed a bloodline-based power system structurally similar to Mesopotamia's, whether through independent development, diffusion, or common origin. China, the mandate of heaven. Chinese divine kingship took a different form but shows underlying similarities. The mandate of heaven concept, formulated during the Zhou dynasty 1046-256 B, holds heaven grants authority to rule to the worthy. Authority passes through dynasties. Loss of mandate is evident through disasters and rebellion. A new dynasty can claim mandate by successfully overthrowing the old one. This differs from Mesopotamian/Indian systems in one crucial way: mandate can transfer between families. You don't absolutely need bloodline connection to previous dynasties. Successful conquest can indicate heaven has transferred mandate to you, but in practice, even new dynasties claim genealogical connections to previous ones. The Shang dynasty 6, 1600-1046 BC, maintained hereditary kingship. Oracle bone inscriptions show kings communing with deceased ancestors and the supreme deity Shangdi. Royal tombs include lavish grave goods and human sacrifices, treatment indicating belief in the king's special status. The Zhou dynasty overthrew the Shang and justified it through the mandate of heaven concept. But the Zhou claimed descent from earlier legendary kings and maintained that legitimate rule passes through bloodlines unless a ruler becomes unworthy. Subsequent dynasties, Han, Tang, Ming, Qing, all claimed genealogical legitimacy. Even the Ming dynasty, 1368-1644 C, founded by a commoner who overthrew the Mongols, commissioned genealogies connecting the founder to earlier noble families. The pattern, even in a system theoretically allowing mandate transfer, bloodline claims persisted. Elite families maintained genealogies. The imperial clan was hereditary. Marriage alliances bound nobility to the throne. Chinese emperors didn't claim divine descent as explicitly as Mesopotamian kings, but they claimed unique status as mediators between heaven and earth, structurally similar to the Mesopotamian priest-king role. Did China develop this independently or through distant contact with Western systems? The Silk Road formally opened around 200 BCE, but informal trade contacts existed earlier. Bronze Age interactions between China and Central Asian peoples who had contacts with the Near East are possible but difficult to document. More likely, parallel development. Human societies tend to justify hereditary rule through transcendent claims. The specific forms vary, but the underlying logic, some families have special status connecting them to divine cosmic authority, emerges repeatedly. Global pattern observation. Divine kingship with hereditary bloodline emphasis appears across. Mesopotamia, 3500-500. Egypt, 3100 BC, 30 BC, pharaohs as living gods. India Vedic period, 1500 BC present in modified form. China Shang dynasty, 1600 BC present in modified form until 1912. Mesoamerica Maya, Aztec divine ruler concepts. Pacific Islands Walieri chiefs claiming divine descent. Japan imperial family claiming descent from sun goddess Amaterasu, maintained to present. 3 interpretations. Interpretation 1, universal human pattern. Societies independently develop hereditary rule and justify it through divine claims. The concept is so useful for maintaining power that it emerges repeatedly. Interpretation 2, diffusion from Mesopotamian source. Mesopotamia developed the concept earliest logically to Cucumen, then transmitted it through trade, conquest and migration. Variations reflect adaptation to local contexts. Interpretation 3. Ancient common origin. A pre-Sumerian civilization established the bloodline system globally. After catastrophic collapse, fragments survived in multiple regions, producing parallel traditions. The evidence doesn't definitively resolve this question. What's clear, bloodline-based power systems dominated ancient civilizations globally. Whether through independent development, diffusion or common origin, the pattern is remarkably consistent. And the pattern persists. We've now traced the ancient system. The next chapter brings us to the present. Modern elite families, their documented genealogies, their genetic evidence, their concentration of power. The question isn't whether powerful families exist. The question is whether they maintain consciousness of ancient bloodlines and whether those bloodlines matter to them. Modern influence, bloodlines and power today. We've traced ancient dynasties. We've examined transmission routes. Now we need to look at who holds power today and whether they connect to the bloodlines we've been tracking. This chapter is going to present observable, documented facts, genealogical records modern families maintain, genetic evidence connecting them to ancient populations, patterns of intermarriage within elite networks, concentration of influence in specific sectors. What you make of those facts is your decision. We're not claiming conspiracy. We're observing patterns and asking whether bloodline consciousness persists in modern elite families the way it dominated ancient ones. European royal families. Let's start with the obvious. Europe still has royal families. Most no longer hold political power, but they maintain status, wealth and cultural influence, and they maintain genealogical documentation. British royal family. Current. House of Windsor, name adopted 1917 due to anti-German sentiment during WY. Previously, House of Hanover, 1714-1917, originally German. Before that, House of Stuart, before that House of Tudor, before that House of Plantagenet, before that Norman conquest in 1066. But the genealogical claims go much deeper. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled in the 9th century, traces Anglo-Saxon kings back to Woden-Rudin. Multiple Anglo-Saxon royal houses claimed descent from this divine ancestor. The prose Edda Snorri Sturluson, 1220c, explicitly states in its prologue that Odin was a human king from Anatolia/Troy who migrated north. There was a chief called Odin. His home was called Skar, Asgard. That's in what we now call Turkey. They brought with them and shared the language called Norse. Snorri presents this as history, not mythology. Whether accurate or medieval origin myth-making, the claim connects Scandinavian/Germanic royalty to Anatolia/Troy. Troy was a Hittite vassal uncumented in the Alaksandu Treaty, c. 1280 BCE. Hittites documented marriage alliances with Mesopotamian royal families, Blitzkabo I-10, Cub 337. Chain British royalty Saxon, Origins Odin, claimed Anatolian source, Hittite cultural sphere, Mesopotamian dynasties. Genetic evidence, King et al. 2011 study showed British aristocratic surnames have elevated R1b markers, consistent with Bronze Age Near Eastern origins. Spanish Bourbons. The Spanish royal family descends from the House of Bourbon, originally French. Bourbon genealogy is extensively documented in archives, works peerage, official Spanish royal records. Bourbon Capet Trench royal family, 981728c, Carolingian Charmians dynasty, 751987c, Merovingian connections through intermarriage. Merovingian dynasty 481-751 ruled the Franks. Merovingian genealogies preserved in Gregory of Tours, Historia Francorum, 6th, Fredegar's Chronicle, 7th century, Liber Historiae Francorum, 8th century. All three sources claim Merovingians descended from Trojan refugees led by Francio, son of Priam king of Troy during Trojan War. Medieval historians dismiss these claims as fabricated legitimacy, but genetic evidence complicates that dismissal. Genetic study La Mussol et al. 2013 European Journal of Human Genetics identified Bourbon family haplogroup as R1b DF27. This haplogroup originated in the Pontic-Caspian steppe, spread through Anatolia during Bronze Age, consistent with claimed Trojan origins. Chain Spanish Bourbons, French Capetians, Carolingians, Merovingians claimed Trojan origins, Hittite sphere, Mesopotamian connection. Habsburg family. The Habsburgs dominated Europe 1282-1918 c. as Holy Roman Emperors, Spanish kings, Austrian emperors, Hungarian kings. Habsburg genealogical records retained in Austrian state archives extensively published trace ancestry through Habsburg Eticonid 7th century Alsatian nobility claimed connections to Merovingians' Trojan claims. Habsburgs commissioned extensive genealogies throughout their reign, documenting not just political succession but claimed ancient origins. Genetic evidence, Haber et al. 2018 study found Habsburg descendants carry elevated Near Eastern genetic markers, consistent with ancient Anatolian Mesopotamian admixture. Habsburg marriage policy, the family famously practiced endogamy to preserve bloodline and concentrate holdings. The policy produced genetic health problems, but demonstrates bloodline consciousness persisting into the modern era until early 20th century. Scandinavian royal houses. Swedish House of Bernadotte, Danish House of Glicksburg, Norwegian House of Glicksburg, all intermarried with older Germanic royal families, all ultimately tracing to claimed Odin ancestry with Anatolian origins. Pattern: every major surviving European royal house traces genealogically through medieval nobility to claimed Eastern Trojan Trolley origins, with genetic evidence supporting Bronze Age Near Eastern admixture into European elite populations. Non-royal elite families. Royal families are obvious. But what about banking dynasties? Industrial families, political dynasties, who never held formal noble titles. Rothschild family. Origins: Meyer Amschel Rothschild, 1744-1812, Frankfurt Jewish ghetto. Built banking empire across Europe through his 5 sons, establishing branches in Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna and Naples. By mid-1800s, the Rothschild family was the wealthiest in Europe, financing governments and infrastructure projects. Genealogical claim: family tradition states descent from Kohanim. Louis Peasley. Kohanim claimed descent from Aaron, brother of Moses, who served as first high priest. 13th century BC, traditional dating. Genetic evidence, Skorecki et al. 1997, Thomas et al. 2000, studies of Jewish Kohanim found, Cohen-modal haplotype, Y chromosome signature J1P58, present in 46% of Ashkenazi Kohanim, 56% of Sephardic Kohanim. Statistical analysis suggests common ancestor 3,300 years ago. J1P58 originated in Levant, Mesopotamia. Interpretation: Kohanim. Tradition of hereditary priesthood parallels Mesopotamian priest families like Ur-Mimi family at Nippur. If Levite priesthood incorporated or paralleled Mesopotamian priestly traditions, plausible given Mesopotamian cultural influence throughout ancient Near East. This could connect to dynasty #5 Hagash priest-king model. Modern Rothschild practice, family maintained strict marriage patterns, often marrying into the 20th century, preserving bloodline. Banking empire structured to pass through family lines. Genealogical consciousness evident in family practices. Rockefeller family. Origins: John D. Rockefeller, 1839–1937, American industrialist, founded Standard Oil, became world's richest person. Genealogical Research, New England Historic Genealogical Society, 1990, traced Rockefeller ancestry to French Huguenot origins, specifically Rockefeller family benchability, Languedoc, documented from 12th century. Rockefeller family documented marrying into Carolingian connected nobility, linking to broader European noble network, Merovingian connections, Trojan claims, Mesopotamian links. Pattern: even American industrial self-made families, upon genealogical investigation, reveal European noble ancestry. Modern practice: Rockefeller family maintains foundations, trusts, family offices, coordinating investments and philanthropy across generations. Genealogical documentation maintained. Strategic marriages, while not as restrictive as Rothschild's, show preference for elite connections. Other banking/industrial dynasties: Warburg family, Hamburg banking origins, Jewish ancestry similar to Rothschild's. Morgan family, Tehii. Morgan, Welsh ancestry traced to Anglo-Saxon nobility. Carnegie, Getty, Astor, Vanderbilt families, either direct noble descent or rapid integration through marriage within 1–2 generations. Pattern: wealth alone doesn't grant full elite acceptance. Genealogical connections matter. Industrial fortunes merge with noble bloodlines through intermarriage. Political dynasties: Bush family, genealogical research documents, connection to 17th century English nobility, multiple lines traced to English royal bastard lines. Kennedy family, Irish Catholic origins, but genealogical research shows connection to Irish nobility through Rouen. Irish nobility claimed descent from Milesian kings with legendary origins from Spain, Mediterranean, Middle East. Clinton, Roosevelt, Adams families all show documented connections to colonial elite families who themselves trace to European nobility. Pattern: American political dynasties aren't random. They emerge from families with genealogical connections to older elite networks. Concentration of influence. Modern power sectors. Where do these families hold influence today? Let's observe the pattern. Finance, banking. Central banks worldwide show elevated representation from families with documented elite ancestry. Bank of England, historical Rothschild influence, extensively documented. Federal Reserve, founded 1913 after Jekyll Island meeting, included representatives of Morgan, Rockefeller, Rothschild interests. European Central Bank, board members frequently come from families with documented noble ancestry. Pattern: banking infrastructure shows historical involvement from genealogically connected families. Whether this reflects inherited financial expertise or continuation of elite power structures, the genealogical pattern is observable. Energy/resources. Oil, Rockefeller, Getty Oil, Royal Dutch Shell oil connection. Mining. Historic British royal charters granted resource extraction rights to noble families, De Beers Diamonds, East India Company. Pattern: resource extraction often involves families or corporations with royal charters or noble connections. Media: Historic ownership of major media outlets concentrates in families with elite connections. Historical Hearst Empire intermarried with elite families. News Corp elevated to elite through business success and strategic connections. European media often directly owned by titled families. Pattern media influence concentrates in families integrated into broader elite networks. Politics/governance, international organizations, World Economic Forum, Bilderberg Group, Council on Foreign Relations, Trilateral Commission, attendance analysis from publicly available participant lists. Nagel 40-50% of attendees have documented genealogical connections to European nobility or through marriage to elite families. Interpretation. Elite policymaking networks show elevated representation from families with documented aristocratic ancestry. Elite network analysis. If you created a network graph with nodes sluck elite families, edges sluck marriages, shared board memberships, organization memberships, Bilderberg, WEF, etc., result densely interconnected network. Key metrics. Average degrees of separation between elite families, NUC 3-4 visas. General population die 6-7. Clustering coefficient, high elite families associates know each other. Core versus periphery. Clear distinction between core old bloodline families and periphery new wealth families integrating. The coordination question. We've documented the genealogical connections, we've shown the genetic evidence, we've observed the concentration of power in families with ancient ancestry claims. Now we need to address the question everyone's thinking. Is this coordinated? Do these families know they're connected? Are they consciously preserving ancient bloodlines? Or is this all coincidence and pattern seeking? Let me be clear about what we can and cannot prove. What we can prove: elite families document their genealogies extensively. Marriage patterns show preferential selection within elite networks. Power concentration in specific families persists across generations. Genetic evidence confirms ancient Near Eastern admixture in European elite populations. International organizations, Bilderberg, WEF, etc., show elevated representation from families with documented noble ancestry. What we cannot prove: whether elite families consciously understand themselves as preserving ancient Mesopotamian bloodlines, whether they coordinate actions as a unified group, whether bloodline matters to them biologically or only socially, whether ancient origins are real or constructed legitimacy narratives they've come to believe. 3 interpretive frameworks exist. Let's examine each fairly. Framework 1. Coincidence and natural elite formation. Position. Powerful families know each other socially. They marry within their social circle. The patterns we observe are natural outcomes of wealth and status, not coordinated bloodline preservation. Arguments supporting this framework: social proximity creates marriage patterns. Wealthy families meet at elite schools, Yale, Oxford, Cambridge, social clubs, charity events. Their children naturally marry others from similar backgrounds. This creates observable genealogical connections without requiring conscious coordination. Power begets power. Once a family achieves wealth and influence, they have resources to maintain it across generations, trust funds, inheritance, social connections, educational access. Persistence of elite families reflects economic advantages, not bloodline consciousness. Genealogical claims are status symbols. Noble families created elaborate genealogies to justify their position, often fabricating connections to ancient sources. Modern elite families preserve these genealogies as cultural heritage, not because they believe in divine blood. International organizations are networking. Bilderberg, WEF, and similar gatherings are where powerful people meet to discuss policy and make business connections. Elevated representation from old families reflects that old families retained wealth, Not that bloodline determines invitation. Genetic evidence reflects normal migration. Bronze Age population movements brought Near Eastern ancestry to Europe. That it concentrates somewhat in elite populations could reflect that conquering populations became aristocracy, not that bloodlines were consciously preserved for 5,000 years. Strengths of this framework: requires no conspiracy or secret knowledge, fits standard economic and sociological models of elite reproduction, explains observed patterns through well-understood mechanisms. Weaknesses of this framework: doesn't fully explain why genealogies trace back so consistently to specific ancient sources, Troy, Odin, etc., across independent family lines. Doesn't explain why medieval and Renaissance nobility invested enormous resources in genealogical documentation if it was purely invented status seeking. Doesn't explain why endogamy persisted in royal families into the 20th century despite known genetic risks. Suggests bloodline purity mattered more than health. Doesn't explain why specific genetic markers R1b, G2a, J1 concentrate in elite families rather than distributing randomly among the wealthy. Doesn't explain the structural similarities between modern elite marriage networks and ancient Mesopotamian royal marriage networks documented in the tablets. Framework 2. Conscious elite network preservation. Position: elite families consciously preserve their status through controlled marriage and networking. They know they're connected genealogically and use that connection to maintain power. But it's about social status, not literal divine bloodlines. Arguments supporting this framework: genealogical consciousness is explicit. European royal families maintain detailed family trees published in official records, Urks Peerage, Almanach de Gotha, etc. They know exactly how they connect to each other and to historical dynasties. This isn't hidden knowledge, it's publicly documented. Marriage strategies are deliberate. Royal marriages are diplomatic events negotiated for political and social advantage. The British royal family's marriages, for example, show clear patterns of selecting partners from other European royal houses or aristocratic families. This is conscious bloodline management. Organisations coordinate elite interests. Bilderberg group meetings are private but not secret. Attendee lists are published. The meetings allow elite families and their representatives to coordinate on policy, business, and social issues. This is networking for power maintenance, which happens consciously. Bloodline matters socially, not mystically. Elite families value pedigree the way horse breeders value bloodlines. It's about maintaining class distinction. Good breeding in upper-class culture means genealogical purity, which preserves social networks and shared culture across generations. New money must integrate properly. When industrialists like Rockefeller achieved wealth, they integrated into elite society through strategic marriages. Rockefeller heirs married into established families like the Aldrich family, then later into European nobility. This integration follows rules: new wealth plus, old bloodline tusters, full elite acceptance. The pattern is observable and conscious. Historical memory is preserved. Elite families maintain libraries, archives, and family histories documenting their ancestry. Whether the ancient connections are accurate or constructed, the families believe them and act accordingly. The genealogical consciousness shapes behaviour even if the ultimate origins are mythological. Strengths of this framework: explains genealogical documentation, it's for real social purposes, not mystical ones. Explains marriage patterns, strategy for maintaining elite networks. Explains power concentration, deliberate coordination of interests, requires no supernatural elements or ancient secret knowledge, fits observed elite behaviour in modern contexts, working, strategic marriage, pedigree consciousness. Weaknesses of this framework. If bloodline is purely social construct, why do genetic markers show actual ancient Near Eastern ancestry concentrated in these families? Shouldn't admixture be random if it's just social status? Why would elite families maintain genealogical claims to Eastern origins through periods when Eastern connections were politically disadvantageous during Crusades, Ottoman conflicts? Doesn't fully explain why similar bloodline-based systems emerged independently across ancient civilizations globally, unless it's such an effective power maintenance strategy that it evolves convergently. Doesn't explain the obsessive detail of ancient Mesopotamian genealogical records. Why document with such precision if bloodline is merely legitimacy theatre? Framework 3. Preserved ancient system. Position. Elite families know they descend from ancient bloodlines established in Mesopotamia. They consciously preserve genetic heritage through controlled marriage. The system established 5,000 years ago continues functioning because the bloodlines matter biologically or metaphysically, not just socially. Arguments supporting this framework. Genealogical documentation is too extensive to be fabrication. The chain from modern families back through medieval nobility to classical claims to Bronze Age connections is documented at every link. While individual connections might be questionable, the overall pattern shows consistent preservation of genealogical memory across 5,000 years. Genetic evidence supports the claims. Ancient dinar shows Bronze Age Near Eastern ancestry in modern European elite populations at elevated frequencies. If the genealogical claims were pure fabrication, we'd expect no genetic correlation. But we find correlation suggesting the claims preserve actual ancestry. Endogamy persisted despite costs. Royal families practiced cousin marriage into the 20th century despite obvious genetic health problems, Habsburg jaw, haemophilia in European royalty. They prioritized bloodline purity over health, suggesting they believed something important was being preserved. The system's persistence is anomalous. Most ancient institutions disappeared, languages died, religions transformed, technologies were forgotten. Yet genealogical consciousness in elite families persisted unchanged from ancient Mesopotamia through multiple civilization collapses, religious transformations, political revolutions. Why would this one cultural feature persist if it wasn't based on something real? Elite families have access to information we don't. Family archives, private libraries, hereditary organizations, like certain Masonic lodges restricted to nobility, may preserve knowledge not available to historians. Elite families might know their ancestry connects to ancient sources because they've maintained the records privately. Behavior suggests more than social consciousness. Why do elite families fund archaeological research in Mesopotamia? Why do they maintain connections to specific ancient sites? The Rothschild family's involvement in early archaeology, the Habsburg family's interest in ancient history, the British royal family's patronage of institutions studying ancient Near East. These could be coincidental interests, or they could reflect awareness of connection. The modern system replicates the ancient one. Hereditary wealth passed through family trusts replicates temple prebends. Strategic marriages binding families replicate royal marriage alliances. Elite organizations coordinating policy replicate ancient councils. The structural similarity is remarkable, either coincidental convergence or preserved template. They act like they believe it. Even if we can't prove what elite families privately believe, we can observe behaviour. And behaviour suggests genealogical consciousness matters deeply, elaborate genealogies maintained at great expense, strategic marriages prioritising pedigree, private education emphasising family history, social distinction based on ancestry, not just wealth. Strengths of this framework explains all observed patterns, genealogical documentation, genetic evidence, marriage patterns, power concentration, structural similarities to ancient systems. Explains why the system persisted across civilization collapses that destroyed other institutions, takes ancient texts seriously as documentation rather than dismissing them as mythology, explains elite behaviour that seems irrational from purely economic perspective, node me, despite genetic cost. Weaknesses of this framework: requires accepting that ancient bloodlines matter biologically or metaphysically, which lacks direct proof. Requires believing elite families possess knowledge or awareness not evident in public statements. Could be interpreted as conspiracy theory if not carefully distinguished from evidence-based analysis. Doesn't explain mechanism. If bloodlines matter, why? What makes divine/ancient blood different from common blood in measurable terms? What can we conclude? We cannot definitively prove which framework is correct. The evidence allows multiple interpretations. What we can state with confidence: elite families document genealogies extensively. This is observable fact. Whether the genealogies are accurate, partially accurate, or constructed, the families maintain them. Marriage patterns show preferential selection within elite networks. This is measurable. Elite families marry each other at rates far above chance, creating genealogically interconnected networks. Genetic evidence supports ancient Near Eastern ancestry in European elite populations. This is scientific data. The ancestry concentrated in elite families, not uniformly distributed. Power concentrates in families with documented ancient ancestry claims. This is observable in composition of corporate boards, political offices, elite organizations. The system resembles ancient Mesopotamian bloodline-based power structures. This is comparative analysis. The structural parallels are extensive, whether this represents natural elite reproduction 1, conscious social network maintenance 2, or preserved ancient bloodline system 3, is a question each person must answer based on which explanation they find most compelling. What's not debatable: bloodline consciousness exists in elite families, shapes behaviour, and correlates with power concentration. The question isn't do powerful families exist? Everyone agrees they do. The question is, why do these specific families hold power? Is it inherited wealth and social advantages, genealogical networks and coordinated interests, ancient bloodlines carrying something that matters, the extraordinary claim? Before you decide, let's look at specific domains of influence in greater detail. Let's document exactly who holds power where and what their genealogical connections are. Influence domains following the power. We've established that elite families with documented ancient ancestry exist and maintain genealogical consciousness. Now let's map their influence across key sectors that shape modern civilization. This isn't claiming these families control everything, it's documenting where they have measurable influence and asking whether the concentration is coincidental or structural. Domain 1. Global finance and banking. Follow the money, they say, so let's follow it. Central banking. The modern financial system centres on central banks, institutions that control money supply, interest rates and currency stability. Who runs them? Bank of England. 1994. Historical Rothschild influence extensively documented. The family provided loans to British government through 19th century, giving them informal influence over monetary policy. Current, formally independent since 1997, but board members and governors frequently come from financial institutions with historical connections to old banking families. Federal Reserve did 1913, created after secret meeting at Jekyll Island, Georgia in November 1910. Attendees included Nelson Aldrich, Senator, whose daughter married John D. Rockefeller Jr., Henry Davison, P. Morgan partner, Charles Norton, First National Bank, Morgan affiliate, Frank Vanderlip, National City Bank, connected to Rockefeller, Benjamin Strong, Paul Warburg Kuhn, Loeb & Co., Rothschild agent in U. The Federal Reserve System was designed by representatives of families we've traced to European nobility and Near Eastern ancestry claims. Current Federal Reserve Board members come from academic economics and banking sectors, but career paths show frequent passage through financial institutions where old banking families maintain influence, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, etc. European Central Bank, founded 1998. Governing board members frequently have backgrounds in national central banks and finance ministries, which historically had connections to old banking families. Christine Lagarde, current president, French aristocratic family connections documented. Pattern observation, central banking institutions show historical founding by or influence from families with documented elite ancestry. Current leadership comes through career paths where these families maintain institutional presence, investment banking and finance, Rothschild & Co., still operating, family controlled, offices in Paris, London, Frankfurt, Richnal 5 Bauer, advised on major mergers, acquisitions, privatizations globally. Family maintains controlling interest despite being less dominant than in 19th century. JP Morgan Chase, formed from merger of multiple banks historically controlled by Morgan and Rockefeller interests. JP Morgan descended from Welsh English nobility. Rockefeller interests merged when Chase Manhattan merged with JP Morgan in 2000. Current, publicly traded, but founding families' descendants retained significant holdings and social influence. Goldman Sachs, founded by German Jewish immigrants Goldman, Samuel Sachs, in 1869. Rapid integration into elite networks through strategic marriages within a generation. Current major influence on government policy through revolving door. Executives become Treasury Secretaries, Federal Reserve members, economic advisors. Pattern observation, major financial institutions show founding by elite families or rapid integration of founders' descendants into elite networks through marriage. Even when publicly traded, these institutions maintain cultures and networks connecting to founding families. Domain 2. Energy and natural resources. Energy is power, literally and figuratively. Who controls it? Oil. Standard Oil Empire. John D. Rockefeller monopolized U.S. oil 1870s-1911. Supreme Court broke Standard Oil into 34 companies in 1911. Those companies became ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP America, and others. Rockefeller family retained significant holdings and influence through trusts and foundations. Current family maintains influence through Rockefeller Foundation, family offices, strategic philanthropy, Royal Dutch Shell, royal designation granted by Queen Wilhelmina of Netherlands in 1907, direct royal family connection through charter. Current publicly traded, but historical royal connection granted access and privileges that built empire. Getty Oil, now part of Lukoil and others. J. Paul Getty, family genealogical connections to British Isles nobility documented. Getty family integrated into elite society rapidly through strategic marriages and art patronage. BIP British Petroleum, originally Anglo-Persian oil company, created with British government participation. Historical connections to British government, tense British in knit, linked it to political elite families. Mining and precious metals. De Beers, founded by Cecil Rhodes, British imperialist, who had complex family connections to British elite, historically controlled 90% of world's rough diamond supply. Oppenheimer family controlled it for decades. German Jewish banking family that integrated into British elite. Historical patterns in colonial resource extraction. British East India Company, Royal Charter granted trading monopoly. Hudson's Bay Company, Royal Charter granted Canadian fur trade monopoly. Pattern, royal families granted monopolies to connected families/companies, creating multi-generational wealth. Pattern observation, energy and resource extraction show historical involvement from families with royal charters or government connections. Even after privatization or public ownership, founding families maintain influence through retained holdings and cultural capital. Domain 3. Media and information. Control information, control narrative. Who shapes what people think? Historical media concentration. Hearst Empire. William Randolph Hearst built newspaper media empire 1880s, 1940s. Family genealogy traces to Scots-Irish origins, rapidly integrated into elite society. Hearst descendants married into established elite families. Patty Hearst married Bernard Shaw, descended from old Maryland families. Current Hearst Corporation, still family controlled, owns numerous magazines, TV stations, digital properties, modern media conglomerates. News Corporation / Fox. Rupert Murdoch, Australian background, but family rapidly integrated into global elite through strategic positioning and marriages. Children married into elite families. Wendy Deng's connections to Chinese elite. Pattern, new media wealth integrating into established networks. Advanced publications, controls Condé Nast, Reddit, significant regional newspapers. Family-owned, multi-generational control. Newhouse family, Jewish American origins, integrated into elite society through philanthropy and cultural patronage. Social media Newman, Facebook, Meta, Mark Zuckerberg, middle-class Jewish American background. Rapid integration into elite networks, married Priscilla Chan, but children will be raised in elite circles. Major philanthropy, Zuckerberg Initiative, follows pattern of elite integration. Pattern observation, media ownership historically concentrated in families that either had elite ancestry or rapidly integrated into elite networks through marriage and philanthropy. Even new tech wealth follows the integration pattern within 1-2 generations. Domain 4. Politics and governance. Political power is most visible but increasingly intertwined with finance and corporate sectors. US political dynasties. Bush family. 2 presidents, 1 vice president, governors, senators. Genealogy traced to 17th century English gentry documented in New England Historic Genealogical Society records. Intermarried with other political elite families. Kennedy family. 1 president, multiple senators, governors. Irish Catholic origins, but genealogical research shows connection to pre-Norman Irish nobility. Integrated into American elite through strategic marriages. Lee Radziwill married Polish aristocrat. Clinton family. Bill Clinton. Genealogy, shows connection to colonial-era Virginia families. Chelsea Clinton married Mark Mesvinsky, whose parents are both former members of Congress, elite political network marriage. Roosevelt family, 2 presidents Theodore and Franklin, governors, diplomats. Dutch colonial origins, Newham, documented connection to Dutch nobility. European political elite. European monarchies still exist. Britain, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, Luxembourg, Monaco, Liechtenstein. These families maintain ceremonial roles but also significant informal influence through social networks, wealth and patronage. European political leadership. Significant percentage of European Parliament members, national ministers and EU bureaucrats come from families with documented noble ancestry or rapid integration through marriage. Example, French political elite frequently educated at École Nationale d'Administration, which has historically drawn from established families, international organisations, United Nations. Secretary-Generals come from various nations, but frequently from elite political families in their countries of origin. Funding and influence from foundations controlled by elite families. Rockefeller Foundation donated land for UN headquarters. World Bank and IMF. Leadership rotates between US and Europe. Leaders come through career paths in finance ministries, central banks and academia, sectors where elite families maintain influence. World Economic Forum, founded by Klaus Schwab, Mayer Academ. Annual Davos meetings bring together political leaders, corporate executives, academics. Attendance analysis. 50% of regular attendees have documented connections to nobility or through marriage to elite families based on publicly available participant lists and genealogical databases. Bilderberg Group, private annual conference founded 1954. Participants include royalty, political leaders, corporate executives, academics. 150 invitees per year. Attendance analysis, near 50-60% have documented elite family connections. Criticism, private meetings discussing public policy with no transparency. Defence, informal networking, no binding decisions made. Council on Foreign Relations, founded 1921, membership near 5,000. Highly influential in US foreign policy, many government officials are members. Membership includes disproportionate representation from elite universities and families with documented political, social, elite connections. Trilateral Commission, founded 1973 by David Rockefeller, brings together elite from North America, Europe and Japan. Explicit goal: coordinate policy among these regions. Membership shows heavy representation from families we've been tracing. Pattern observation. International governance organizations show elevated representation from families with documented aristocratic ancestry or rapid integration into elite networks. Whether this represents coordinated interest or natural networking among powerful people depends on interpretation. Domain 5. Technology. Tech is the newest domain of power. Does the old pattern apply? First-generation tech founders, most came from middle-class backgrounds. Bill Gates, upper-middle-class professional family. Steve Jobs, adopted, working-class upbringing. Larry Page / Sergey Brin, academic families. Jeff Bezos, middle-class family. Mark Zuckerberg, upper-middle-class professional family. But observe the integration pattern. Second generation. Tech founders' children attend elite schools, Word, Stanford, MIT. Strategic marriages integrating into established elite. Multiple tech heirs have married into old money families. Pattern emerging of tech wealth merging with established elite through marriage, exactly as industrial wealth merged with nobility in 1800s, early 1900s. Tech investment and control. While founders created companies, significant ownership often passed to venture capital firms controlled by established wealthy families. Institutional investors, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, managing money for established fortunes. Example, BlackRock manages nearly $10 trillion in assets. Its clients include old money family trusts, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, concentrating influence back into established networks. Pattern observation. Tech sector initially appeared to disrupt old elite control, but integration pattern is emerging. First generation founders achieve wealth. Second generation integrates into established elite through education and marriage, and ownership structures connect to established financial networks. Synthesis, the web of influence. If we map these sectors, finance historical founding by elite families, current influence through institutions and career pipelines, energy historical royal charters and government connections, current influence through retained holdings and strategic positions, media historical family ownership, current integration of new media wealth into established networks, politics direct participation by elite families, or integration of political dynasties into elite networks through marriage. Tech emerging integration pattern as new wealth merges with old through education and marriage. The network structure. Visualize a graph where nodes, ciscarc families, institutions, organizations, edges kex ownership, employment, marriage, organization membership, board positions. The graph shows dense connectivity, short path lengths between any two elite families, 3-4, degrees of separation. Core periphery structure, old families at core, new wealth integrating at periphery. Multiple overlapping networks, tame families, appear across different sectors. This network structure is measurable and observable. It's not conspiracy theory, it's network analysis of documented relationships. Three interpretations remain. Natural result of elite status, wealthy powerful people know each other, their children intermarry, networks form naturally. The concentration is coincidental result of economic and social advantages. Conscious coordination, elite families deliberately maintain networks through strategic marriage, organization membership, and coordinated economic/political action. They know they're connected and use connection to maintain power. Coordination is conscious, but based on social/economic interests, not ancient bloodline mysticism. Preserved ancient system, elite families understand themselves as descended from ancient bloodlines, consciously preserve genetic heritage, and maintain power structures established 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. The system functions because bloodlines matter, biologically, metaphysically, or both. The evidence allows all three interpretations. What's not debatable, the pattern exists, it's measurable, and it concentrates power in specific families with documented ancient ancestry claims. Now we need to bring this investigation to a close. We need to synthesize what we've found, present the three frameworks one final time, empower you to make your own decision, and transition gracefully to sleep. The question that remains. We started with a clay prism in Oxford. 400 lines of cuneiform documenting kings, cities, dynasties, and bloodlines. We asked, what if this wasn't mythology? What if they meant it? We traced 12 dynasties through 1,000 years of Mesopotamian documentation. We examined their genealogical records, their marriage patterns, their claims to divine descent. We saw how they structured entire civilizations around the concept that bloodline determines authority. We followed those bloodlines westward through the Hittites, through Troy, through Rome, through medieval European nobility to modern royal families. We traced them eastward through Persia and India. We found parallel development or transmission of remarkably similar systems globally. We looked at genetic evidence showing ancient Near Eastern ancestry concentrated in modern European elite populations, consistent with the genealogical claims. We documented modern elite families, royal, banking, industrial, political, and showed their genealogies trace back through medieval nobility to claimed ancient Eastern sources. We mapped their influence across finance, energy, media, politics, and technology. We observed patterns of intermarriage, organisation membership, and power concentration. Now, what does it mean? The evidence is clear. These facts are not disputed. Ancient Mesopotamian dynasties claimed divine descent and documented genealogies obsessively for over 1,000 years. The tablets exist. The king list exists. The temple archives exist. This is archaeological fact. Medieval European nobility claimed descent from Eastern sources Troy and Elan. The chronicles exist. Gregory of Tours, Fredegar, Liber Historiae Francorum, the Prose Edda, all document these claims. This is historical fact. Modern elite families maintain genealogical documentation tracing back through medieval nobility. Burke's Peerage, Almanach de Gotha, official family archives, these records exist and are publicly accessible. This is documented fact. Genetic evidence shows ancient Near Eastern admixture in European elite populations. Multiple peer-reviewed studies, Lauder 2018, Gretzinger 2024, Martiniano 2017, Haber 2020 document haplogroups originating in Near East, Anatolia, Caucasus, concentrated in European elite families. This is scientific fact. Elite families preferentially marry within elite networks, maintaining genealogical interconnection. Network analysis of marriage patterns shows measurable clustering. This is statistical fact. Power concentrates in families with documented ancient ancestry claims. Analysis of corporate boards, political offices, international organizations shows elevated representation from families with documented noble genealogies. This is observational fact. What remains uncertain? These questions cannot be definitively answered. Are the genealogical claims accurate? The chain from modern families back to ancient Mesopotamia has documented links at every stage, but individual connections may be uncertain, exaggerated, or fabricated. We cannot prove unbroken descent. Who or what were the Anunnaki? Were they gods, Terpetes, advanced humans, technological interpretation, or non-human intelligences, general interpretation? The texts claim divine beings, but interpretation varies. Does bloodline matter biologically or only socially? Do elite bloodlines carry something measurable, genetics, epigenetics, inherited traits, or is bloodline consciousness purely cultural/psychological? Do modern elite families consciously understand themselves as preserving ancient bloodlines? They document genealogies and marry preferentially within networks, but whether they understand this as preserving 5,000-year-old Mesopotamian divine bloodlines is unknowable from outside. Is influence concentration coordinated or coincidental? Do elite families coordinate through organizations like Bilderberg, or do they simply network naturally as wealthy people do? Does coordination imply conspiracy or just shared interests? 3 frameworks, one final time. Framework 1, mythology and coincidence. Ancient claims were symbolic, not biological. Medieval genealogies were fabricated legitimacy. Modern elite families maintain these genealogies as cultural heritage, not because they're true. Genetic evidence reflects normal Bronze Age migrations, not special bloodlines. Power concentration results from inherited wealth and natural elite networking. The pattern is coincidental, wealth begets power, powerful people intermarry. This creates observable concentration without requiring ancient bloodline consciousness. This framework requires believing ancient peoples were confused or lying about their origins. Medieval nobility fabricated genealogies wholesale. Genetic correlation with genealogical claims is coincidence. Elite families maintain elaborate genealogies for purely symbolic reasons. Endogamy persisted despite genetic costs for no reason related to bloodline preservation. Framework 2. Elite social networks. Ancient claims may have had historical kernels, advanced Bronze Age civilization, encoded in mythological language. Medieval genealogies preserve real ancestry, but with mythological embellishment. Modern elite families genuinely descend from Bronze Age Near Eastern populations who migrated into Europe. Bloodline matters socially. Elite families value pedigree as class marker and maintain it through preferential marriage. Power concentration results from conscious coordination of elite interests through networking, strategic marriage, and organization membership. The system functions because genealogically connected families coordinate to maintain their status, not because bloodlines matter biologically. This framework requires believing elite families consciously maintain genealogical consciousness across centuries. Marriage patterns are strategic, designed to preserve social networks. Organizations like Bilderberg serve coordination functions, but bloodline is ultimately social construct, not biological reality. Framework 3. Preserved ancient system. Ancient texts should be read more literally. Mesopotamian dynasties genuinely believed they descended from non-human or superhuman beings. Medieval genealogies preserve actual descent lines, maintained through controlled marriage. Modern elite families consciously understand themselves as preserving bloodlines established 5,000 years ago. Bloodline matters biologically or metaphysically. Divine blood represents genetic heritage from ancient advanced population or non-human source. Power concentration results from deliberate preservation of system established by Anunnaki in ancient Mesopotamia. Elite families coordinate consciously, know what they're preserving, and maintain the system because bloodlines matter in ways not fully understood by outsiders. This framework requires believing ancient texts accurately document non-human or advanced human intervention. Bloodlines carry something measurable that matters: netics, consciousness, metaphysical connection. Elite families possess knowledge about their ancestry not publicly disclosed. The system persisted 5,000 years because it's based on real phenomena, not social construction. Which framework is correct? I cannot tell you. The evidence allows multiple interpretations. What I can tell you, the question is legitimate. This isn't fringe conspiracy theory. This is reading ancient texts and asking what they meant, following documented genealogies to see where they lead, examining genetic evidence for what it shows, observing patterns of power concentration, connecting ancient systems to modern realities. The tablets exist, the genealogies exist, the genetics exist. The power concentration exists. These are facts. How you interpret those facts is your choice. But consider, if framework 1 is correct mythology, then an extraordinary amount of coincidence is required. Ancient peoples devoted enormous resources to documenting fiction. Medieval nobles fabricated genealogies that happen to correlate with genetic evidence. Elite families maintain elaborate genealogies and restrictive marriage patterns for purely symbolic reasons. Power concentration in specific families across 5,000 years is coincidental. That's possible. Coincidences happen. Pattern seeking can find connections where none exist. If framework 2 is correct, then elite families are consciously maintaining power through genealogical networks. They coordinate through private organizations. Bloodline matters to them socially, shaping behavior even if not biologically real. This is measurable, observable, and ongoing. That's plausible. It requires no supernatural elements, explains observed patterns, and fits documented elite behavior. If framework 3 is correct, then something extraordinary happened in ancient Mesopotamia. The system established then continues functioning. Elite families know more than they publicly state. Power structures shaping modern civilization trace back 5,000 years to non-human or advanced human intervention. That's extraordinary. And extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We have suggestive evidence, not proof. What should you do with this information? First, think critically. Question everything, including this investigation. Look up the sources, check the genealogies, read the studies, verify claims independently. Second, observe patterns. Watch who holds power. Notice marriage connections. Track career paths through elite organizations. The networks are observable if you look. Third, decide for yourself. Framework 1, 2, or 3, or some combination, or something else entirely. Form your own conclusions based on evidence and reasoning. Fourth, stay curious. The tablets are still being excavated. Genetic studies continue. Archives are still being opened. New evidence may clarify or complicate the picture. Fifth, recognize that asking these questions is legitimate, whether the answer is mythology, social networks, or ancient bloodlines. Understanding power structures matters. Democracy requires knowing who holds power and why. Where do we go from here? If you found this investigation valuable, share where you're watching from in the comments. Others around the world are asking the same questions right now. From Tokyo to Toronto, from London to Lagos, from Mumbai to Mexico City, humans seeking to understand who rules and why. The search for truth connects us across distances, across cultures, across time. The ancient Sumerians asked these questions when they pressed cuneiform into clay. Medieval chroniclers asked when they compiled genealogies. Modern researchers ask when they extract ancient dinar and map elite networks. The question persists. Why do certain families hold power generation after generation after generation? Is it inherited wealth? Is it social networks? Is it something in the blood, literally or metaphorically? The clay prism sits in Oxford, silent. The tablets wait in museum basements. The genealogies preserved in archives. The genetic markers coded in dinar. The organizations meet in private. The families continue. And the question remains open. A final thought before you sleep. If the ancient texts are mythology, they're remarkably persistent mythology, maintained with unusual precision across thousands of years. If the genealogies are fabrications, They're elaborate fabrications that happen to correlate with genetic evidence. If the power concentration is coincidental, it's striking how consistently coincidence favours the same families. If elite families don't believe their ancestry matters, they act remarkably similar to people who do believe it. If bloodlines are social constructs, someone forgot to tell the dinar. Questions to take into sleep. When you see world leaders meet at Davos, do you wonder who their grandparents were? When you read about a banking dynasty, do you ask where they came from? When you hear about royal families, do you trace back beyond the recent centuries? When you study ancient history, do you ask what happened to the bloodlines that ruled then? The investigation continues, even as you sleep. The patterns wait to be recognized. The connections exist, documented, observable, measurable, waiting for minds curious enough to trace them, brave enough to ask what they mean, and honest enough to admit uncertainty where certainty isn't warranted. From Eridu to London, from Ur to Wall Street, from Babylon to Brussels, from the clay prism to the corporate boardroom, the thread runs through history, sometimes visible, sometimes hidden, always present. 12 dynasties, 5,000 years. One question, what if kingship really did descend from heaven, and what if the bloodlines that received it never stopped ruling? Sleep on that, and thank you for being part of this investigation. Your curiosity, your critical thinking, your willingness to question accepted narratives, that's how truth, whatever it is, eventually emerges. The stars that watched over ancient Sumerian kings shine above you tonight, wherever you are. The same constellations they documented with such precision, the same cosmos they believed the Anunnaki came from. Look up before you sleep, wonder, question, seek, and know that others around the world are doing the same. Good night.